The candle in Elira's hand shook as she pressed her back against the cold stone wall, listening to the footsteps that echoed down the corridor above her. It was well past midnight, and she was not supposed to be near the east wing, where the old family portraits hung behind locked doors. Her heart pounded so loudly she feared it might give her away. She had only wanted to look at one painting, just once, before the household woke and the day of endless chores began again. But now a lantern light was moving closer, and she had nowhere to run. She pressed herself into the shadow of a large wooden cabinet and held her breath. The footsteps belonged to Edmund Carver, the estate steward, a tall man with sharp eyes who noticed everything that happened within the walls of Ashworth Manor. If he found her here, she would lose her position, and losing her position meant losing the only home she had known since she was a small child. The footsteps paused just outside the cabinet. Elira closed her eyes, waiting for the moment he would pull back the curtain and expose her. But after a long, silent stretch of time, the footsteps moved away, turning down another hallway. She let out a breath she did not know she had been holding, and slipped quietly toward the servants' stairs, her candle flickering with every hurried step. Only when she reached the small room she shared with two other maids did she allow herself to feel safe again. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed and looked down at her wrist, where a strange mark, shaped like a small crescent moon, rested against her skin. She had always had it, for as long as she could remember, though none of the other girls in the orphanage where she grew up had anything like it. She used to imagine it meant something important, though she had long since told herself such thoughts were foolish daydreams, the kind poor servant girls were not allowed to have. Morning came quickly at Ashworth Manor, as it always did. The house rose before the sun, its wide halls filling with the sound of boots on stone floors, the clatter of pots in the kitchen, and the low murmur of servants exchanging quiet words before their long day of labor began. Elira rose with the others, tied back her long brown hair, and made her way down to the kitchen where Nora Fenwick, the head cook, was already shouting orders to the younger staff. "You are late again, girl," Nora said without looking up from the bread she was kneading. "The dining hall needs setting before the household rises, and you know the master does not tolerate a disorderly table." "Yes, Nora," Elira replied, tying an apron around her waist. She did not argue, though her tiredness from the night before pulled at her limbs. She had learned long ago that servants who complained were servants who did not last. The manor was enormous, a place built of gray stone and tall windows, surrounded by gardens that stretched far beyond what any one person could walk in a single day. It had belonged to the Ashworth family for generations, a family known across the region for its wealth, its influence, and its long history of tragedy that seemed to follow it like a shadow. Elira had heard whispers about that history from the older servants, stories of a violent uprising many years ago that had torn the family apart and left the estate in ruins for a time before it was rebuilt. She had never paid much attention to those stories. They belonged to a world far above her own, a world of nobility and titles that had nothing to do with a servant girl who scrubbed floors and carried trays. As she moved through the dining hall, setting silver plates and polishing goblets until they shone, she caught her reflection in one of the large mirrors that lined the walls. She paused for a moment, studying her own face. There was something in the shape of her eyes, in the way she held her shoulders straight, even when carrying heavy loads, that made the older women in the kitchen sometimes look at her strangely, as though searching for something they could not quite place. She had grown used to those looks and no longer thought much of them. By mid-morning, word had spread through the house that the master of the estate, Duke Alaric Ashworth, was returning that very day, after years spent managing family holdings across the sea. The staff moved with new urgency, cleaning every corner of the manor, preparing the finest rooms, and rehearsing the proper manners expected when serving a man of his rank. Elira had never met the Duke, for he had left the estate before she arrived as a young girl, taken in by the household through an arrangement she barely understood, something to do with a debt owed to the orphanage that raised her. "He is a hard man, they say," whispered one of the younger maids, a girl named Bridget, as they folded linens together in the laundry room. "Cold since his wife passed. Do not expect kindness from him." "I expect nothing from any master," Elira said simply, though a small flicker of curiosity stirred within her despite her words. The carriages arrived, just as the sun began to dip low over the western hills, casting long golden light across the manor's stone courtyard. Elira watched from a distance, standing near the kitchen entrance with a basket of vegetables in her arms, as the household staff lined up to greet their returning master. Duke Alaric Ashworth stepped down from the finest carriage, dressed in dark traveling clothes that still carried an air of authority, despite the dust of a long journey. He was younger than Alira had expected, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to take in everything around him without revealing what he thought of it. He greeted his steward with a brief nod and walked into the manor without a single glance toward the gathered staff, his expression unreadable. Elira thought little of it. Masters rarely looked at servants, and she had no reason to expect this one would be different. She returned to her work, carrying the vegetables to the kitchen, where Nora was already shouting about the evening meal that needed to be prepared for the Duke's first night home. That evening, as the household settled into the long process of serving dinner, Elira was assigned to carry trays into the dining hall, a task usually reserved for more senior servants. She moved carefully, balancing a heavy tray of roasted meats and fresh bread, her steps measured and quiet as she had been trained. When she entered the hall, she found the Duke seated alone at the long table, his steward standing nearby, discussing matters of the estate in low, serious tones. As she set the tray down, her sleeve caught the edge of a silver dish, sending it clattering against the table. She froze, certain she would be scolded, perhaps dismissed entirely for such clumsiness in front of the master on his very first night home. But instead of anger, the Duke simply looked up at her, his expression curious rather than irritated. "You are new," he said, his voice calm and measured. "Not new, my lord," Elira answered quickly, steadying the dish and lowering her eyes as she had been taught. "I have served here for many years." "Strange," he said, studying her for a moment longer than seemed necessary. "I do not recall your face." "I would not expect you to, my lord," she said softly. "You have been away a long time." Something in her tone, calm and unafraid despite the situation, seemed to catch his attention. He did not dismiss her immediately as she expected. Instead, he watched her a moment longer, before returning to his conversation with Edmund Carver, though Elira noticed his eyes drift toward her once more, as she finished setting the table and left the room. She thought little of the exchange as she returned to the kitchen, certain it meant nothing beyond a passing moment of curiosity from a tired man returning from a long journey. She had no way of knowing that her calm response, her steady composure in the face of a nobleman's gaze, had struck the Duke as unusual, unlike anything he expected from the servants of his household. Later that night, after the dishes were cleared and the household began to settle into sleep, Elira found herself once again drawn toward the east wing, toward the locked room where the old family portraits hung. She was not sure why the paintings called to her so strongly, only that something about them felt important in a way she could not explain. She moved quietly through the darkened halls, careful this time to listen for footsteps before turning each corner. She reached the heavy door at last and found it, to her surprise, unlocked. She hesitated only a moment before slipping inside, her candle casting flickering light across the rows of painted faces that lined the walls. Dukes and duchesses long passed, their eyes seeming to follow her as she moved slowly through the room. She stopped in front of one painting in particular, a portrait of a young woman with dark hair and a calm, steady expression, dressed in fine clothing far beyond anything Elira had ever worn. She stared at the painting for a long moment, an unexplainable feeling rising in her chest. There was something familiar about the woman's face, something that made Elira's hand rise unconsciously to her own cheek, as though checking to see if she resembled the portrait somehow. She told herself it was foolishness, the kind of daydream she had promised herself long ago to abandon, and yet she could not look away. A sound behind her made her spin around, candle nearly slipping from her grip. Edmund Carver stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "You should not be here," he said quietly, though there was something in his voice that was not quite anger. "I am sorry," Elira said quickly, moving toward the door. "I only wished to see the paintings. I will not return." Edmund did not stop her as she passed, though his eyes lingered on her face a moment longer than she expected, studying her features with a strange, careful attention. He said nothing further, but as she hurried away down the corridor, she could feel his gaze following her, long after she had disappeared into the darkness of the servants' stairwell. She did not know it yet, but that single glance would set into motion a chain of events that neither she nor anyone else in the household could have predicted. Events that would soon unravel everything she believed about who she was and where she truly belonged. The next morning brought a strange restlessness to Alira that she could not shake. As she moved through her usual duties, sweeping the long gallery and polishing the brass fixtures near the main staircase, her thoughts kept drifting back to the portrait she had seen the night before. She told herself repeatedly that it meant nothing, that resemblance between strangers was common enough, and that a servant girl had no business imagining connections between herself and the noble families whose halls she cleaned. Yet the feeling refused to leave her, settling instead into a quiet corner of her mind, where it waited patiently to be noticed again. Nora called her into the kitchen before the midday meal, handing her a list of tasks that would keep her busy well into the afternoon. The Duke had requested a formal luncheon for a visiting merchant who handled trade agreements for the estate, and the entire staff had been given strict instructions to ensure everything proceeded without a single mistake. Alira welcomed the distraction, grateful for work that demanded her full attention and left little room for wandering thoughts. She spent the next several hours preparing linens, arranging flowers cut fresh from the garden, and helping polish the fine silverware reserved for important guests. The luncheon itself passed smoothly, the Duke speaking little but listening carefully, as the merchant discussed shipments and prices for goods traveling through the region. Alira caught only brief glimpses of the Duke as she moved in and out of the dining hall, refilling glasses and clearing empty dishes, careful to remain as invisible as a well-trained servant should be. It was not until the merchant departed and the household began settling into the quieter rhythm of late afternoon that Alira found herself alone in the library, tasked with dusting the tall shelves of books that lined every wall. She had always loved this room, though she rarely had reason to linger in it. The scent of old paper and leather bindings filled the air, and sunlight poured through the tall windows, casting warm patches of light across the wooden floor. She was reaching to dust the topmost shelf when the door opened behind her, and she turned to find the Duke himself standing in the doorway, watching her with the same curious expression he had shown the night before. "You seem to favor this room," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "I apologize, my lord," Alira said quickly, lowering the cloth in her hand. "I was only completing my assigned duties. I did not mean to intrude upon your privacy." "You are not intruding," he said, moving toward one of the shelves and running his fingers along the spines of several books. "I find it rare that anyone in this house shows genuine interest in these volumes beyond dusting them." Alira hesitated, unsure how to respond to such an unexpected comment from a man of his station. Servants were not meant to engage in conversation with their masters beyond what duty required, yet something in his tone suggested he was not simply making idle talk. "I do enjoy reading, my lord, when time allows," she admitted carefully, "though such moments are rare given my duties." The Duke studied her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "What is your name?" he asked finally. "Alira," she answered, keeping her eyes respectfully lowered. "Alira," he repeated, as though testing the sound of it. A simple name for someone who carries herself rather differently than the others in this house. She did not know how to respond to such an observation, and so she remained silent, unsure whether he expected an answer at all. He seemed to sense her discomfort, and allowed the moment to pass, selecting a book from the shelf and settling into a chair near the window, without further comment. Alira returned to her dusting, though she remained acutely aware of his presence throughout the remainder of the afternoon, feeling his occasional glance drift toward her, even as he appeared absorbed in his reading. When evening arrived and she was finally dismissed from her duties, Alira made her way back to the small room she shared with the other maids, her mind full of questions she dared not voice aloud. She had served in this household for years, without once drawing the attention of its master, and now within a single day, he had spoken to her twice, studied her with an interest she could not explain, and remarked upon qualities in her that she herself had never fully recognized. Bridget was already in the room when she arrived, sitting on her bed and mending a torn sleeve by candlelight. She looked up as Alira entered, her expression curious. "You were seen leaving the library with the Duke still inside," Bridget said, her voice carrying the particular tone of someone eager for gossip. "What happened?" "Nothing happened," Alira said, though a faint warmth rose in her cheeks, despite her best efforts to remain composed. "He asked my name. That is all." Bridget raised an eyebrow, but said nothing further, returning to her mending with a knowing smile that suggested she did not entirely believe such a simple explanation. Alira ignored her, settling onto her own bed and staring up at the low wooden ceiling above her, her thoughts drifting once again toward the portrait in the locked room, toward the strange mark on her wrist, and toward the unsettling sense that something important was beginning to stir beneath the quiet surface of her ordinary life. She did not sleep easily that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the painted face of the young woman from the portrait, and every time she opened them, she found herself glancing at the crescent-shaped mark on her wrist, wondering, despite every effort to silence the thought, whether it meant something after all. Outside her small window, the manor stood silent and still, beneath a sky full of distant stars, keeping its secrets locked away within stone walls that had witnessed far more than any servant girl could yet imagine. Elira woke suddenly in the darkness, her heart racing, before she even understood why. Something had shifted in the room, a small sound out of place among the familiar breathing of the other sleeping maids. She lay still, straining her ears, and then she heard it again, the faint creak of the wooden chest at the foot of her bed, the one where she kept her few belongings. She opened her eyes just enough to see a shadowed figure kneeling beside her bed, hands moving carefully through the folded cloths inside the chest. Fear shot through her chest, sharp and immediate. She sat up quickly, and the figure froze. "Who is there?" she whispered, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound firm. The figure rose slowly, and moonlight from the small window revealed the face of Edmund Carver, the steward, his expression caught somewhere between guilt and calm control. "Forgive the intrusion," he said quietly, careful not to wake the other girls. "I did not intend to frighten you." "You were searching my belongings," Elira said, pulling her blanket tighter around her shoulders, confusion and fear mixing in her chest. "Why would you do such a thing in the middle of the night?" Edmund studied her for a long moment before answering, his voice low and measured. "There have been questions raised about your arrival at this household many years ago. I am simply trying to understand the truth of certain records that do not add up as they should." "What records?" Elira asked, sitting fully upright now, alarm replacing her earlier fear. "I have done nothing wrong. I have served this house faithfully since I was a child." "I do not accuse you of wrongdoing," Edmund said gently, though his eyes remained sharp with unspoken thought. "But something about your history troubles me, and I intend to understand it fully before I speak of it to anyone else, including the Duke." Before Elira could ask further questions, Edmund turned and left the room, as quietly as he had entered, leaving her sitting alone in the darkness, her mind spinning with unanswered fears. She glanced toward the chest at the foot of her bed, wondering what exactly he had been searching for, and whether he had found it. Sleep did not return easily that night, and by the time morning arrived, Elira felt the weight of exhaustion pressing behind her eyes as she rose to begin her daily duties. She said nothing to Bridget or the other maids about what had happened, unsure how to explain an event she barely understood herself. Instead, she moved through her morning tasks with a quiet unease that refused to fade, glancing over her shoulder more than once as though expecting to find Edmund watching her from some hidden corner of the house. The household was busy that day, preparing for an important visit. Word had spread that the Duke intended to host a formal gathering within the week, welcoming several notable guests from neighboring estates, including a respected older nobleman named Lord Percival Grant, a longtime friend of the Ashworth family, who had known the household for decades, before the tragedy that had once nearly destroyed it. The staff worked tirelessly cleaning the great hall, polishing silver, and preparing menus fit for such distinguished company. Elira found herself assigned to help arrange fresh flowers throughout the manor, a task that kept her moving between the gardens and the main hall for much of the morning. It was during one of these trips, carrying an armful of white blossoms toward the entrance, that she nearly collided with the Duke himself, who was walking briskly through the corridor deep in thought. "Forgive me, my lord," she said quickly, steadying the flowers before they could scatter across the floor. "No harm done," he replied, though he paused rather than continuing on his way. He studied her for a moment, his expression softer than she expected. "You appear tired this morning." "I did not sleep well, my lord," she admitted, unsure why she offered such honesty to a man of his station. "It is nothing of importance." "You need not hide discomfort from me," he said, his voice carrying an unexpected gentleness. "If something troubles you, you may speak freely." Elira hesitated, tempted for a brief moment to tell him of the strange encounter with Edmund the night before, but she quickly reconsidered. She had no proof of wrongdoing. only confusion, and speaking of it, might only create trouble for herself within the household. "I am simply tired from preparations for the gathering, my lord," she said instead, nothing more. The Duke did not appear entirely convinced, though he did not press further. Instead, he glanced toward the flowers in her arms and offered a rare, small smile. "The garden has produced fine blossoms this season. You have chosen well for the hall." "Thank you, my lord," she said, feeling an unfamiliar warmth rise in her chest at such simple praise. She continued on her way, though she could feel his gaze lingering behind her as she walked, much as it had during their previous encounters. That evening, after the household settled into its usual quiet rhythm, Elira found herself once again drawn toward the library, though this time she told herself it was simply to return a book she had borrowed, rather than any deeper desire to seek out the Duke's company. She found him there as she expected, seated near the fireplace, with a stack of papers before him, his expression tired from the day's demands. "You are still working, my lord," she observed as she placed the book gently on its shelf. "There is always work when one manages an estate such as this," he said, setting down his pen and rubbing his eyes. "Though I confess, I find little enjoyment in the endless correspondence required of my position." "Perhaps a moment of rest would serve you well," Elira suggested carefully, unsure whether such a comment overstepped her place. He looked up at her with faint amusement. "You speak boldly for a servant." "Forgive me, my lord," she said quickly, lowering her eyes. "I did not intend disrespect." "I did not say I minded it," he replied, his tone softening once more. "In truth, I find it refreshing. Most in this house speak to me only with careful formality, saying precisely what they believe I wish to hear. You seem to speak your honest thoughts." Elira did not know how to respond to such an observation, and so she remained silent, though a small warmth spread through her chest at his words. The Duke studied her a moment longer, before gesturing toward the chair across from his own. "Sit, if you wish," he said. "I find myself in need of conversation that does not involve figures or trade agreements." She hesitated, uncertain whether accepting such an invitation was appropriate for someone of her position, yet something in his tone suggested genuine sincerity, rather than a command she dared not refuse. She sat carefully at the edge of the chair, her hands folded politely in her lap. They spoke for a long while that evening, of simple things at first, the changing seasons, the history of the books lining the shelves, the quiet beauty of the estate's gardens at dusk. Elira found herself surprised by how easily conversation flowed between them, how the careful distance she maintained with every other member of the household seemed to soften in his presence. The Duke, for his part, appeared equally at ease, his usual guarded expression relaxing into something closer to genuine warmth as their conversation continued. It was only when the candle burned low and the hour grew late that Elira realized how much time had passed. She rose quickly, suddenly aware of how such an extended conversation with the master of the house might appear to others.
"I should return to my duties, my lord,"
she said.
"Forgive me for keeping you so long."
"You need not apologize," he said, rising as well. "I have enjoyed this conversation more than I expected." As she turned to leave, he spoke once more, his voice quieter than before. "Elira," he said, and she paused at the sound of her name. "Thank you for treating me as a person, rather than simply a title." She did not know how to respond to such a statement, and so she offered only a small nod before slipping quietly from the room, her heart beating with a confusion of emotions she could not fully name. As she made her way back toward the servants' quarters, she passed Edmund Carver standing near the base of the main staircase, his expression unreadable as he watched her pass. Neither of them spoke, though the weight of his silent observation followed her long after she had disappeared from his sight, a quiet reminder that the questions surrounding her past had not been forgotten, only set aside for the moment, waiting patiently to resurface when she least expected it. The days leading up to the gathering passed in a blur of ceaseless activity. Every room in Ashworth Manor received fresh attention, from the polishing of ancient wooden banisters to the careful arrangement of fine china that had not been used since before the Duke's long absence. Elira found herself pulled in a dozen directions at once, her hands rarely resting as she moved between tasks assigned by Nora in the kitchen and instructions passed down from the household's senior staff. Despite the exhausting pace, she noticed a change in how she approached her work. Where once she had moved through her days with quiet acceptance, simply completing what was expected without much thought beyond the task at hand. She now found herself thinking often of her conversation with the Duke, replaying his words in her mind during quiet moments between chores. She told herself repeatedly that such thoughts were foolish, that a servant girl had no business dwelling on kind words, spoken by a nobleman, who likely thought little more of the exchange once it ended. Yet the thoughts persisted regardless of her efforts to dismiss them. Bridget noticed the change as well, watching Elira with growing curiosity as the days passed. "You hum while you work now," she observed one afternoon, as they folded linens together in preparation for the guest chambers. "You never used to hum." "I did not realize I was humming," Elira said, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "The whole kitchen has taken notice of how often the Duke seeks you out," Bridget continued, lowering her voice, though there was no one nearby to overhear. "Nora says it is not proper, a man of his station, spending so much time in conversation with a servant girl." "We have spoken only a handful of times," Elira said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew they did not fully capture the growing frequency of their encounters. "There is nothing improper in polite conversation." Bridget did not appear convinced, though she said nothing further, returning to her folding, with a knowing expression that made Elira uncomfortable. She understood the danger in such rumors spreading through the household, understood that servants who drew too much attention from their masters often found themselves the subject of unwelcome gossip, or worse, dismissed entirely to avoid scandal. Yet she could not bring herself to regret the conversations she had shared with the Duke, conversations that had awakened something within her she had not known was missing. Edmund Carver, meanwhile, continued his quiet investigation with careful discretion, though Elira remained unaware of the full extent of his efforts. He spent long hours in the estate's records room, a small chamber tucked away near the cellar where old documents and ledgers were stored, searching through years of correspondence and household accounts for any mention of a child brought to the orphanage, under circumstances matching Elira's arrival at Ashworth Manor. He found little at first, the records frustratingly incomplete, pages seemingly removed or altered in ways that suggested deliberate concealment rather than simple neglect. He said nothing of his suspicions to the Duke, uncertain whether his instincts held any true foundation, or whether he was simply imagining connections where none truly existed. Yet each incomplete record, each missing page, only deepened his conviction that something significant had been hidden long ago, something that involved the quiet servant girl who had somehow captured the attention of the estate's master, without any apparent effort to do so. On the evening before the gathering, Elira found herself once more in the library, though this time she had been sent specifically to deliver a message from Nora regarding the final arrangements for the following day's feast. She found the Duke standing near the tall windows, gazing out at the darkened gardens beyond, his expression distant and thoughtful. "My lord," she said softly, announcing her presence, "Nora asked me to confirm the seating arrangements for tomorrow's gathering." He turned toward her, and for a moment, something in his expression seemed almost relieved, as though her presence had interrupted thoughts he did not particularly enjoy. "The arrangements are fine as discussed," he said, "though I confess I find myself with little enthusiasm for tomorrow's festivities." "Is something troubling you, my lord?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. He studied her for a long moment before answering. "Lord Percival Grant has requested this gathering specifically, insisting it is time I consider matters of marriage and succession, now that I have returned to manage the estate permanently. He means well, I believe, though I find such conversations tiresome." Elira felt an unexpected tightness in her chest at his words, though she quickly reminded herself that such matters were entirely beyond her concern. A duke's marriage was a matter of politics and family alliance, nothing that involved a servant girl, no matter how many quiet conversations they had shared in the privacy of the library. "I am certain the evening will proceed well, my lord," she said carefully, keeping her voice steady, despite the strange discomfort stirring within her. "Perhaps," he said, though his tone suggested he was not entirely convinced. He studied her a moment longer, as though wishing to say something further, before seeming to reconsider. "Thank you for delivering the message, Elira. You may return to your duties." She curtsied politely and left the room, though she carried with her a growing unease she could not fully explain, a sense that the coming gathering would bring changes to the quiet rhythm of her life that she was not yet prepared to face. The goblet slipped from Lord Percival Grant's trembling hand and shattered against the marble floor. red wine spreading across the polished tiles, like an accusation no one in the great hall could ignore. Conversation halted instantly. Every head turned toward the elderly nobleman, whose face had gone pale as he stared across the crowded room, his eyes fixed on a young servant girl carrying a tray of fresh bread toward the long banquet table. "Forgive me," Lord Percival managed, though his voice shook, and his gaze did not waver from Alira, who had frozen mid-step, unsure whether she had somehow caused the accident herself. "I believe I simply lost my grip." A servant rushed forward to clean the spilled wine, while conversation slowly resumed around the hall, guests returning to their meals and quiet discussions, as though nothing unusual had occurred. Yet Lord Percival remained still, his eyes tracking Alira's every movement as she continued her duties, delivering bread to the far end of the table, before retreating toward the kitchen with practiced efficiency. The Duke, seated at the head of the table, noticed his old friend's strange behavior, and leaned toward him with quiet concern. "Percival, are you unwell? You have gone quite pale." "I am simply tired from the journey," Lord Percival said, though his voice remained unsteady. "Forgive an old man his occasional lapses." He said nothing further throughout the remainder of the meal, though his eyes continued drifting toward the kitchen entrance whenever Alira reappeared to serve additional courses, his expression a mixture of confusion and something that looked remarkably like grief. When the feast finally concluded, and the guests began retiring to the drawing room for quiet conversation and drinks, Lord Percival excused himself early, claiming exhaustion from his travels, though he lingered near the entrance to the kitchen corridor, rather than proceeding toward the guest chambers as expected. It was there that Edmund Carver found him, standing quietly in the shadows, his expression troubled. "My lord," Edmund said, approaching carefully. "Is something amiss?" Lord Percival turned to him slowly, his eyes still carrying the shock of whatever he had witnessed during the meal. "The young servant who carried the bread this evening," he said quietly. "What do you know of her origins?" Edmund felt his pulse quicken at the question, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. "Her name is Alira. She has served this household since childhood, brought here through an arrangement with a distant orphanage." "Why do you ask, my lord?" "Her face," Lord Percival said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have not seen such a resemblance in 15 years, not since the night everything changed for this family." Edmund's heart pounded against his ribs, though he forced himself to remain calm. "What resemblance do you speak of, my lord?" Lord Percival glanced around to ensure no one else could overhear, before continuing, his voice low and urgent. "She bears the very image of Duchess Isolde, the Duke's young cousin who vanished during the uprising that nearly destroyed this estate all those years ago. I held that child in my arms myself when she was born. I would know her face anywhere, and that servant girl carries it as though time itself had stood still." Edmund felt a chill pass through him despite the warmth of the hall around them. He had suspected something significant hidden within the incomplete records he had spent weeks investigating, yet hearing such a direct confirmation from someone who had known the missing Duchess personally sent a wave of urgency through his careful, methodical mind. "I have found irregularities in the household records concerning her arrival," Edmund admitted quietly. "Pages missing, entries altered. I had begun to suspect something was being concealed, though I dared not speak of it without proof." Lord Percival's expression grew grave. "If what I suspect is true, then the girl serving bread at this very table tonight is no servant at all, but the rightful heir to this entire estate, a duchess presumed lost these 15 years past. We must proceed with great caution, Edmund. Such a revelation, if mishandled, could bring great danger upon her, and considerable upheaval upon this household." "Does the Duke know?" Edmund asked, his mind already racing through the implications of such a discovery. "He knows nothing," Lord Percival said, "and we must consider carefully how and when such truth should be revealed to him, for it will change everything he believes about his own inheritance and his place within this family." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, and both men fell silent as Alira herself appeared in the corridor, carrying an empty tray back toward the kitchen. She paused upon seeing them, sensing immediately the tension in their expressions. "My lords," she said carefully, offering a polite curtsy, "forgive the interruption. I did not mean to intrude." "You intrude on nothing, child," Lord Percival said, his voice gentle, despite the storm of emotion clearly churning beneath his calm exterior. He studied her face for a long moment, taking in every detail as though committing it permanently to memory. "Tell me, do you know anything of your parents, or of how you came to this household as a young child?" Elira felt a strange unease at the question, though she answered as honestly as she could. "I know very little, my lord. I was brought to the orphanage as an infant, and later placed in service here, through some arrangement I never fully understood. I have no memory of my parents, nor any knowledge of where I truly came from." Lord Percival nodded slowly, his expression softening with something that looked remarkably like sorrow. "Thank you for your honesty," he said quietly. "You may return to your duties." She curtsied once more, and continued toward the kitchen, though she could feel the weight of their combined gaze following her, long after she disappeared from view. Once she was gone, Lord Percival turned back to Edmund, his expression resolute, despite the emotion still visible in his eyes. "We must gather proof beyond doubt before we speak a single word of this to anyone else, including the Duke," he said firmly. "A mistake in such a matter could cost that young woman everything, perhaps even her safety, should certain parties learn of what we suspect before we are prepared to act." "What parties do you mean, my lord?" Edmund asked, though something in Lord Percival's tone suggested he already understood the gravity of what lay ahead. "There were those who benefited greatly from the disappearance of the true heir all those years ago," Lord Percival said quietly, his eyes darkening with old memories. "Baron Silas Crane among them, a man who gained considerable land and influence in the chaos following the uprising, land that would rightfully return to its true owner, should the missing Duchess ever be found alive. We must proceed carefully, Edmund, for I fear such a man would not welcome the truth we now suspect." The two men continued their quiet conversation late into the night, formulating a careful plan to investigate further without drawing unwanted attention, while throughout the manor, the household settled into sleep, unaware of the storm quietly gathering above their heads, a storm that would soon reveal secrets buried for 15 long years, secrets that would change the fate of everyone within Ashworth Manor forever. Unknown to Edmund and Lord Percival, their hushed conversation near the kitchen corridor had not gone entirely unwitnessed. Baron Silas Crane, a guest of considerable influence who had also attended the evening's gathering, stood at a distance near the drawing-room entrance, having excused himself briefly from a conversation about trade routes to seek fresh air. He had noticed Lord Percival's dramatic reaction during the meal, the shattered goblet, the pale expression, the eyes that refused to look away from the servant girl carrying bread across the hall. Such behavior from a man normally so composed had not escaped his careful attention. Baron Crane was known throughout the region as a shrewd and calculating man, having expanded his own holdings considerably in the years following the uprising that had once threatened to destroy the Ashworth family entirely. Few questioned how a minor lord had risen to such prominence so quickly during those chaotic years, and Baron Crane preferred it remain that way. He watched now from the shadows as Edmund and Lord Percival spoke in low, urgent tones, unable to hear their exact words, but recognizing immediately that something significant troubled them both. He waited until they parted ways, before approaching Lord Percival directly, offering a polite smile that did not quite reach his calculating eyes. "You seemed quite affected during dinner, old friend," he said smoothly. "I trust nothing serious troubles you." "Merely the fatigue of travel," Lord Percival replied, though his voice carried a careful edge that suggested he did not entirely trust the Baron's sudden concern. "Nothing worth mentioning." Baron Crane studied him a moment longer, sensing the deflection, but choosing not to press further in the moment. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Do rest well tonight. Tomorrow brings further festivities, and I would hate for you to miss them, due to exhaustion." He excused himself, and retreated toward his own guest chamber, though his mind churned with calculating thoughts throughout the walk. He had learned long ago to trust his instincts regarding matters that threatened his carefully built position, and something about Lord Percival's reaction that evening struck him as far more significant than simple fatigue. He resolved quietly to keep careful watch over the coming days, determined to understand what secret had so thoroughly unsettled a man normally as composed as Lord Percival Grant. Meanwhile, in the servants' quarters, Elira lay awake long after the household had fallen silent, her mind replaying the strange encounter with Lord Percival and Edmund near the kitchen corridor. Something in the elderly nobleman's expression, the way he had studied her face, as though searching for someone else entirely, unsettled her deeply, though she could not fully articulate why. "You are troubled," Bridget whispered from her own bed nearby. apparently noticing Alira's restlessness in the darkness. "What happened tonight?" "An old lord looked at me as though he recognized me from somewhere," Alira admitted quietly, "though I have never met him before in my life. It felt strange, Bridget, as though he saw someone else entirely when he looked at my face." Bridget was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Perhaps you simply remind him of someone from his past. The elderly often see echoes of old memories in unexpected places. I would not trouble yourself over it." Alira wanted to accept such a simple explanation, wanted to dismiss the unsettling encounter as nothing more than an old man's fading memory, playing tricks upon him. Yet something deep within her refused to fully believe such reassurance. A quiet, persistent feeling that something important had shifted that evening, something that would not simply fade away with the morning light. She thought once more of the crescent-shaped mark upon her wrist, of the strange familiarity she had felt studying the portrait in the locked east wing weeks earlier, of the countless small moments throughout her life, when others had looked at her with expressions she could not quite explain. Individually, each moment meant little. Together, they formed a pattern she had spent years refusing to examine too closely, fearful of what such examination might reveal about a past she barely remembered. Sleep eventually claimed her, though it brought little peace, her dreams filled with fragmented images of a grand hall filled with frightened voices, of being carried swiftly through darkened corridors by unfamiliar arms, of a woman's tearful voice whispering words she could not quite understand, before everything dissolved into darkness once more. She woke before dawn, her heart pounding, though she remembered nothing clearly beyond the lingering sense of fear and loss that clung to her like morning mist, refusing to burn away beneath the rising sun. The following days brought a strange tension to Ashworth Manor that Alira could not fully explain, though she noticed it in small ways throughout her daily routine. Edmund seemed to watch her more closely than before, his expression thoughtful whenever their paths crossed. Lord Percival, though he remained a guest at the estate for several more days before his planned departure, made a point of seeking her out on several occasions, engaging her in brief conversations about her earliest memories, her time at the orphanage, and any details she might recall from before her arrival at the manor. She answered his questions as honestly as she could, though she found herself growing increasingly curious about his persistent interest in her past. She did not yet understand the full weight of what such questions might eventually reveal, nor did she suspect that Baron Silas Crane had begun his own quiet investigation, driven by a very different motivation entirely, one rooted not in compassion or duty, but in a desperate need to protect the considerable fortune he had built upon the foundation of a 15-year-old secret that now threatened, for the first time, to finally come undone. The wheels of the carriage rattled loudly over the uneven road as Edmund Carver gripped the edge of his seat, glancing repeatedly through the small window behind him at the darkened path stretching away into the countryside. He was certain another set of wheels had followed his own carriage since leaving Ashworth Manor an hour earlier, though each time he looked, the road behind remained empty, illuminated only by pale moonlight and the distant flicker of scattered farmhouse windows. He had told no one of his true destination that evening, informing the household staff only that he traveled on estate business requiring his personal attention. In truth, he journeyed toward a small cottage on the edge of a neighboring village, home to a woman named Agnes Whitlow, once the personal nursemaid of the missing Duchess Isolde, before the uprising had scattered the household and stolen away the infant heir entirely. Lord Percival had provided her name and location before departing the estate several days earlier, insisting that Agnes might hold answers neither of them could find within the incomplete estate records. The carriage finally rolled to a stop outside a modest stone cottage, its windows glowing faintly with candlelight despite the late hour. Edmund stepped down carefully, instructing his driver to wait nearby, before approaching the cottage door and knocking softly. After a long moment, the door opened to reveal an elderly woman with silver hair and sharp, alert eyes that studied him carefully before she spoke. "You are the steward from Ashworth Manor," she said, her voice steady despite her evident age. "Lord Percival sent word that you might come." "Forgive the late hour," Edmund said, removing his hat respectfully. "I would not have intruded were the matter not of great importance." Agnes studied him a moment longer before stepping aside to allow him entry, gesturing toward a small wooden table near the hearth. "Sit," she said. "I suspect I know why you have come." Edmund settled into the offered chair, watching as Agnes moved slowly to prepare tea. her hands steady despite the visible tremor of age that affected her movements elsewhere. "Lord Percival believes he has found the lost Duchess," Edmund said carefully, watching her reaction closely. "A young servant girl within our household bears a striking resemblance to the child you once cared for." Agnes paused in her preparations, her back still turned toward him, though Edmund noticed her shoulders tense visibly at his words. "I wondered if this day would ever come," she said quietly, turning finally to face him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I have carried this burden alone for 15 long years, wondering whether the child I helped save that terrible night still lived, or whether my efforts had been in vain." Edmund leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "You know something of what happened that night?" Agnes nodded slowly, settling into the chair across from him, her expression heavy with old grief. "I was there when the uprising began, when armed men stormed the estate, seeking to claim it for themselves during the chaos of that terrible time. The Duke and Duchess, Isolde's parents, were killed defending their household, and I fled with the infant Duchess in my arms, desperate to keep her safe from those who sought to eliminate every trace of the true bloodline." "Why did you not simply return her once the uprising was suppressed?" Edmund asked. "Because I discovered, in the chaos of hiding, that certain men within the estate's own household had conspired with the attackers, hoping to seize control of the family's holdings, once the direct line was eliminated entirely," Agnes said, her voice trembling with old anger. "I could not trust anyone within the household to protect her safely, and so I made the difficult choice to leave her at a distant orphanage, under a false name, praying she would grow up safe and unaware of the danger that had once threatened her very life." "Baron Silas Crane," Edmund said quietly, the pieces finally falling into place within his mind. "Lord Percival suspected he benefited greatly from the chaos of that time." Agnes's expression darkened further at the name. "I never possessed direct proof of his involvement, only suspicion born from careful observation during those chaotic days. He arrived at the estate remarkably quickly once the uprising began, offering assistance that conveniently positioned him to claim considerable land and influence once the true heirs could no longer contest such claims. I dared not accuse him openly without proof, fearing for my own safety and that of the child I had sworn to protect." Edmund sat in stunned silence for a long moment, absorbing the weight of what Agnes had revealed. "Do you possess anything that might serve as proof of the child's true identity?" he finally asked. "Something beyond memory and resemblance alone." Agnes rose slowly and moved toward a small wooden chest tucked into the corner of the cottage, retrieving a folded piece of cloth that she carried carefully back to the table. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing a small silver locket, engraved with a crest Edmund immediately recognized as belonging to the Ashworth family. "I placed this within her belongings before leaving her at the orphanage," Agnes said softly, hoping that one day, should fate allow it, someone might recognize its significance and understand the truth of who she truly was. "I could not risk keeping it with me, fearing it might be discovered and used to trace her whereabouts before she was old enough to protect herself." "She may not even know she possesses it," Edmund said quietly, his mind racing with the implications of such a discovery. "Then you must find it," Agnes said firmly, her eyes meeting his with fierce determination, despite her age. "And you must proceed with the utmost caution, Master Carver. If Baron Crane still holds the influence and ruthlessness I once feared, he will not welcome the truth returning after all these years, to threaten everything he has built upon her presumed death." Edmund thanked Agnes profusely, before departing the cottage well past midnight, his mind heavy with the weight of what he had learned. As his carriage began the long journey back toward Ashworth Manor, he glanced once more through the small rear window, and this time, he was certain he saw the faint outline of another carriage following, at a careful distance behind his own, its lanterns deliberately unlit to avoid detection within the darkness of the countryside road. His pulse quickened with sudden alarm. He instructed his driver to increase their pace, watching anxiously as the distant carriage seemed to match their increased speed rather than falling behind. Only when they finally passed through the gates of Ashworth Manor did the pursuing carriage veer away into a side road, disappearing into the darkness before Edmund could determine who exactly had taken such interest in his late-night journey. He entered the manor quietly, his mind troubled by the unmistakable sense that his secret investigation had somehow drawn unwanted attention, and that time to uncover and protect the truth about Elira's identity was growing shorter than he had originally believed. As Edmund crossed the quiet courtyard toward the manor entrance, a voice called out from the shadows near the stable, startling him so severely he nearly dropped the small bag he carried. "A late hour for estate business, Master Carver." Edmund turned to find Baron Silas Crane standing near the stable entrance, dressed in traveling clothes despite the late hour, his expression carrying the same polished calm he presented to every guest and servant alike. Edmund's heart pounded, though he forced his voice to remain steady. "Matters of the estate rarely respect convenient hours, my lord," Edmund replied carefully. "I trust you are well tonight." "Quite well," Baron Crane said, stepping closer, his eyes studying Edmund with unsettling attentiveness. "I could not sleep, and thought a walk might settle my restlessness. Tell me, does your business tonight concern the young Duke's household affairs, or perhaps something of a more personal nature?" "Simply routine matters, my lord," Edmund said, keeping his expression carefully neutral despite the alarm rising within him. "Nothing that would interest a guest of your standing." Baron Crane's smile did not waver, though something calculating flickered briefly behind his eyes. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Do rest well, Master Carver. I suspect the days ahead may prove rather eventful for this household." He turned and walked unhurriedly toward the guest wing, leaving Edmund standing alone in the darkened courtyard, his pulse still racing from the unexpected encounter. He could not determine whether Baron Crane's words carried genuine suspicion or simply idle conversation, yet something in the man's tone left him deeply unsettled. Once safely within his own private study, Edmund locked the door carefully before drawing paper and ink from his desk drawer, composing an urgent letter to Lord Percival, detailing everything Agnes Whitlow had revealed that evening. He wrote of the locket, of the conspiracy suspected within the household during the uprising, and of his uneasy encounter with Baron Crane in the courtyard moments earlier, an encounter that left him convinced their quiet investigation had somehow already drawn dangerous attention. He sealed the letter carefully and resolved to send it by his most trusted messenger at first light, understanding now that whatever truth lay hidden behind Alira's origins, it would need to be uncovered swiftly and protected carefully, before those who benefited from her continued anonymity found a way to ensure the truth remained buried forever. Sleep did not come easily to Edmund that night, his mind turning over every detail Agnes had shared, every implication of Baron Crane's unsettling presence in the courtyard, and every possible danger that now threatened a young woman who remained entirely unaware of the storm, quietly gathering around her ordinary, unassuming life within the walls of Ashworth Manor. Baron Crane did not return immediately to his guest chamber that night. Instead, he waited within the shadows of the courtyard until he was certain Edmund had retired fully, before making his own quiet way toward the stables, rousing a groom he had quietly bribed upon his arrival at the estate days earlier. "Prepare my carriage," he instructed the groom in a low voice. "I require it within the hour, and I expect this errand to remain entirely between us." The groom nodded silently, understanding well enough that questioning a nobleman of Baron Crane's standing would serve him poorly. Within the hour, Baron Crane's carriage rolled quietly from the estate grounds, its lanterns unlit, following the same road Edmund's carriage had traveled earlier that evening, though Baron Crane possessed no need to follow directly, already suspecting precisely where such a late-night journey might have led. He had learned long ago the names and locations of everyone who might possess dangerous knowledge from the events of 15 years past, maintaining careful, quiet awareness of such individuals, even as the years passed, and the danger they represented seemed increasingly distant. Agnes Whitlow's name remained near the top of that mental list, a woman he had never fully trusted, despite her apparent disappearance from public life following the uprising. His carriage arrived outside her cottage well before dawn, and he approached the door with the same calculated calm he presented in every social situation, knocking firmly, despite the early hour. Agnes answered eventually, her expression hardening the moment she recognized him standing upon her doorstep. "Baron Crane," she said coldly, "I did not expect a visit from you after all these years." "A pleasant surprise, I hope," he said smoothly, though his eyes carried none of the warmth his voice suggested. "I understand you received a visitor earlier this evening, someone from Ashworth Manor perhaps, inquiring about matters from long ago." Agnes's expression remained carefully guarded, though Baron Crane noted the slight tension in her posture that confirmed his suspicions. "I receive occasional visitors," she said evenly, I fail to see how my personal affairs concern you, my lord. They concern me a great deal, Baron Crane said, his tone shifting subtly, the polished charm giving way to something colder and more direct. Should those affairs involve certain events from the uprising that nearly destroyed the Ashworth family 15 years ago, I would advise you strongly to consider carefully what you share with visitors regarding matters long since settled. Some matters are never truly settled, Agnes replied, her voice steady despite the clear threat underlying his words. Especially when innocent lives were unjustly stolen to serve the ambitions of those who profited from tragedy. Baron Crane studied her for a long, tense moment, his expression unreadable. I have built a respectable life from the opportunities circumstance provided me, he said finally. I would hate to see old, unproven suspicions disrupt the peace this region has enjoyed since those difficult years past. Consider this a friendly warning, Agnes, offered out of respect for your years of quiet service to this family. He turned without waiting for her response and returned to his waiting carriage, leaving Agnes standing in her doorway, her expression a mixture of fear and renewed determination. She understood clearly now that Baron Crane suspected the truth was beginning to surface, and that he would not hesitate to protect his considerable fortune by any means necessary, should the missing Duchess truly be found alive within the walls of Ashworth Manor. As Baron Crane's carriage began its journey back toward the estate, his mind worked quickly through the possibilities before him. If the servant girl Lord Percival had reacted to so strongly during the banquet truly was the missing Duchess, he would need to act swiftly and carefully to protect everything he had built over the past 15 years, before the truth could be confirmed and presented in a manner that might strip away his lands, his title, and the comfortable life he had constructed from the ashes of a tragedy he had helped orchestrate far more directly than anyone within Ashworth Manor yet suspected. Elira pressed herself flat against the corridor wall, her breath caught in her throat as she listened to voices drifting from the half-open study door ahead of her. She had only meant to deliver a tray of tea to the Duke as instructed, but the sound of Edmund's urgent, hushed tone had stopped her mid-step, and something in his words had rooted her in place, despite every instinct telling her to continue on her way. The resemblance is undeniable, my lord, and Agnes herself confirmed the child was carried from the estate the very night of the uprising. Elira's heart pounded so loudly she feared it might betray her presence. She did not fully understand the context of what she overheard, yet something about the conversation felt dangerously close to herself, close enough that she could not force her feet to carry her away as they should have. She strained to hear more, careful to keep the tea tray steady despite her trembling hands. You are certain of this, Edmund? The Duke's voice asked, tense with an emotion she had never heard from him before. You believe a member of my own household staff might be my missing cousin? Elira's breath caught entirely. The words settled over her like a sudden chill, impossible and disorienting all at once. She could not imagine who they might be discussing, yet something deep within her recognized the shape of the conversation, recognized it the way one recognizes a half-remembered dream upon waking. A floorboard creaked beneath her shifting weight, and both voices within the study fell instantly silent. Elira froze, certain she had been discovered, her mind racing for some plausible explanation for her presence in the corridor. After a tense moment, footsteps approached the study door, and she quickly composed herself, adjusting the tray in her hands and stepping forward as though she had only just arrived. Edmund opened the door fully, his expression carefully neutral, though Elira noticed a flicker of alarm cross his features upon seeing her standing there. Elira, he said, his voice measured, we did not hear you approach. I have brought the tea you requested, my lord, she said, addressing the Duke directly, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage, despite her racing thoughts. Forgive me if I arrived at an inconvenient moment. The Duke studied her closely, his expression unreadable, though something in his gaze seemed to search her face with unusual intensity. Thank you, Elira, he said finally. You may leave the tray here. She set the tray down carefully upon his desk, aware of both men watching her every movement with a scrutiny she could not fully explain. As she turned to leave, the Duke spoke once more, his voice softer than before. Elira, he said, and she paused at the door. Might I ask you something before you return to your duties? She turned back toward him, her heart still racing, though she forced herself to appear calm. Of course, my lord. Do you recall anything at all from before your time at the orphanage? He asked carefully. Any fragment of memory, however small, from your earliest years? The question struck her with unexpected force, echoing so closely the fragmented dreams that had plagued her sleep in recent nights, that she found herself momentarily unable to answer. "Very little, my lord," she said finally, choosing her words carefully. "Only vague impressions I have never been able to fully understand. Why do you ask?" The Duke exchanged a brief glance with Edmund before answering. "Simple curiosity," he said, though his tone suggested far more weight behind the question than he was willing to reveal. "You may return to your duties, Alira. Thank you for the tea." She left the study with her thoughts spinning wildly, the overheard fragments of conversation refusing to settle into any coherent understanding. She did not return immediately to the kitchen, instead finding a quiet corner near the servants' stairwell, where she could gather her composure before facing the demands of her remaining duties. Later that evening, after the household had grown quiet, the Duke sought her out once more in the library, his expression carrying a warmth that seemed determined to push aside whatever troubling conversation had occupied his afternoon. "You seem distracted this evening," he observed, as she dusted the shelves nearest his favorite reading chair. "Forgive me, my lord," she said. "I have simply had much on my mind." "As have I," he admitted, setting aside the book he had been pretending to read. "Alira, I find myself in an unusual position. I have known you only a short time, and yet I find myself thinking of our conversations far more often than propriety would likely suggest is wise." Alira's hands stilled upon the shelf she had been cleaning, her heart quickening at his unexpected candor. "My lord, I am simply a servant within your household. Such thoughts would bring only difficulty for us both." "I am aware of the difficulty," he said quietly, rising from his chair and moving toward her. "Yet I find myself unable to fully dismiss what I feel, regardless of such difficulty. You speak to me honestly, Alira, in a way no one else within this household dares. You do not flatter me, nor do you fear me. I find that rarer and more valuable than any title or fortune I possess." She did not know how to respond to such an admission, torn between the caution she had cultivated throughout years of careful service, and the undeniable warmth that stirred within her chest at his words. "My lord," she began carefully, "I do not know what to say to such a confession." "You need not say anything at all," he said gently. "Only know that my feelings toward you are genuine, whatever complications they may bring in the days ahead." They stood in comfortable silence for a long moment, the weight of unspoken possibility settling gently between them, neither entirely certain how to proceed given the vast difference in their respective positions within the household and the wider world beyond its walls. Alira eventually excused herself, her mind and heart equally full of confusion, wondering how such tender feelings could coexist alongside the unsettling fragments of conversation she had overheard earlier that same afternoon. Conversation that suggested her entire understanding of who she was might soon be turned completely upside down. Sleep proved elusive again that night, though this time the cause was not fear alone but a tangled mixture of hope and confusion that refused to let her mind rest quietly. She rose earlier than usual the next morning, moving through the gardens before her duties began, hoping the cool morning air might help settle her scattered thoughts. She found the gardens already occupied. The Duke walked slowly along the gravel path near the rose beds, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression thoughtful as he gazed out toward the distant hills beyond the estate walls. He noticed her approach and offered a small, genuine smile that eased some of the tension she had carried since the previous evening. "You are awake early," he observed as she drew nearer. "As are you, my lord," she replied, falling into step beside him, though she remained careful to maintain a respectful distance, appropriate to their difference in station. "I find the mornings offer the only true peace available to a man in my position," he said. "Once the household wakes fully, my time belongs entirely to matters of business and obligation." They walked together in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crunch of gravel beneath their feet and the distant song of birds greeting the rising sun. Alira found herself increasingly at ease in his presence. The careful formality she maintained with every other member of the household, softening naturally whenever they spoke. "May I ask you something, my lord?" she said finally, curiosity overcoming her usual caution. "Of course," he replied, glancing toward her with open interest. "Yesterday, you asked whether I remembered anything from before the orphanage," she said carefully. "Might I ask why such a question weighed upon your mind so heavily?" The Duke was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how much he wished to reveal. There are matters currently under investigation within this household, he said finally. Matters concerning events from many years past that may prove significant to several people currently residing here, yourself included perhaps. I am not yet at liberty to share full details, as much remains uncertain, but I promise you, Alira, that whatever truth eventually surfaces, I intend to see it handled with fairness and care. She wanted desperately to press further, to demand clarity regarding whatever secret seemed to swirl increasingly around her ordinary existence, yet something in his tone suggested he genuinely could not yet share more, and she respected the boundary his position required of him. "Thank you for your honesty, my lord," she said instead, "even if it offers more questions than answers." He chuckled softly at that, a rare and genuine sound that brightened his usually serious expression. "You possess a remarkable patience, Alira. One, I confess, I do not always share myself." They continued their walk a while longer, conversation drifting toward lighter subjects, the history of the rose gardens, memories of his childhood spent exploring the estate's grounds, before duty and loss had settled heavily upon his shoulders. Alira found herself laughing genuinely, for the first time, in what felt like many days, the easy warmth between them, chasing away, if only briefly, the shadow of uncertainty that had followed her since Lord Percival's fateful reaction during the banquet. As the sun rose higher and the household began stirring toward its usual morning routine, they parted ways near the kitchen entrance, both aware that lingering longer might draw unwanted attention from the staff already beginning their daily tasks. Yet as Alira turned to enter the kitchen, the Duke caught her hand gently for just a moment, his expression sincere. "Whatever the coming days reveal," he said quietly, "know that my regard for you remains unchanged, Alira, regardless of station or circumstance." She felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, though a quiet unease lingered beneath that warmth, an instinctive understanding that whatever secret loomed on the horizon might prove far more complicated than either of them yet realized. She entered the kitchen with her thoughts still lingering on the garden path, unaware that her extended absence that morning had already drawn curious attention from Nora, who watched her closely as she finally appeared for her duties, a knowing expression settling across the cook's weathered features that suggested the quiet rumors already circulating through the household had only just begun to grow louder. That afternoon, as Alira scrubbed pots in the kitchen alongside Bridget, her friend leaned close, her voice barely above a whisper, despite the noise of the busy kitchen around them. "The other maids speak of nothing else but you and the Duke," Bridget said. "Someone claims to have seen you walking together in the gardens this very morning." Alira felt her stomach tighten with sudden worry. "It was an innocent conversation, nothing more," she said. Though even as she spoke, she knew the words did not fully capture the depth of what had passed between them. "Innocent or not, such talk could bring you great trouble," Bridget warned, her expression genuinely concerned, despite her earlier teasing. "Nora already suspects something, and if word reaches beyond this household to those who might use it against you, the consequences could be severe. Servants who become entangled with their masters rarely find happy endings, Alira. You know this as well as I do." "I am aware of the danger," Alira said quietly, setting down the pot she had been scrubbing. "Yet I do not know how to simply stop what has already begun to grow between us." Bridget studied her friend's troubled expression for a long moment before softening her tone. "I only worry for your safety and your future," she said gently. "This household holds secrets deeper than either of us fully understands, and I fear you may be standing closer to those secrets than you realize." Her words settled uncomfortably close to the truth Alira herself had begun to suspect, though neither of them yet understood the full scope of what awaited discovery. Alira said nothing further, returning to her work with a heavy heart, torn between the genuine warmth she felt toward the Duke and the mounting sense that forces far beyond her control had already begun moving pieces into place around her, preparing to reveal a truth that would change everything she believed about her quiet, unremarkable life within the walls of Ashworth Manor. Unseen by either young woman, a junior stable hand named Colin Marsh paused near the kitchen doorway, having overheard fragments of their conversation while delivering firewood for the evening meal. Colin had recently accepted a small sum of money from an agent claiming to represent interests concerned with the general welfare of the estate, an agent who had asked him simply to report any unusual behavior among the household staff, particularly concerning the young maid named Alira. Colin thought little of the strange request at the time, assuming it harmless curiosity from some distant relative of the family. He did not yet understand that the information he now carried toward a pre-arranged meeting later that evening would find its way directly into the calculating hands of Baron Silas Crane, drawing the net of suspicion and danger ever tighter around a young woman who remained almost entirely unaware of just how many eyes had quietly turned toward her in recent days. A sharp knock on the door made Alira jump so violently she nearly dropped the small object clutched in her trembling fingers. She had been alone in the room for only a few minutes, taking advantage of a rare, quiet moment to sort through the small collection of belongings stored beneath her bed, when her fingers had brushed against something hard and unfamiliar, sewn into the lining of an old blanket she had carried with her since childhood. "Alira, are you within?" Bridget's voice called from the corridor, followed by another knock. "One moment," Alira called back, her voice unsteady, as she quickly closed her fist around the small object and shoved it beneath her pillow, before rising to open the door. She found Bridget standing there, carrying a stack of folded aprons. "Nora requires these delivered to the laundry room before evening," Bridget said, then paused, studying Alira's flushed expression with obvious curiosity. "Is something wrong? You look as though you have seen a ghost." "I am simply tired," Alira said quickly, taking the aprons from her friend's arms. "I will deliver these directly." Bridget lingered a moment longer, clearly unconvinced, before shrugging and returning to her own duties. Once she was gone, Alira closed the door carefully and retrieved the object from beneath her pillow, her heart still pounding as she finally examined it properly in the fading afternoon light streaming through her small window. It was a locket, small and delicately crafted from tarnished silver, its surface engraved with an intricate design she did not immediately recognize. She turned it over carefully in her palm, noting the fine craftsmanship far beyond anything a servant girl would typically possess. Her fingers found a small clasp along its edge, and after a moment of careful effort, the locket sprang open, revealing a tiny portrait, painted with remarkable detail, depicting a young woman and man, both dressed in fine clothing that suggested considerable wealth and status. Alira stared at the miniature portraits for a long moment, an inexplicable feeling rising within her chest, something between recognition and profound loss, though she could not identify either face with any certainty. She turned the locket once more in her trembling hands, and this time noticed a small engraving along its inner edge, letters worn faint with age, but still legible if she squinted carefully in the dim light. The engraving read simply, "Isolde, beloved daughter." Her breath caught sharply in her throat. She had heard that name before, whispered briefly during the overheard conversation between the Duke and Edmund in the study days earlier. She had dismissed it then as unrelated to herself, yet now, holding this locket that had clearly been hidden within her own belongings since childhood, she could no longer dismiss the growing certainty that these fragments were somehow connected to her own forgotten past. She sat heavily upon her bed, the locket clutched tightly in her palm, her mind racing through every strange occurrence of recent weeks. Lord Percival's shocked reaction during the banquet, the Duke's careful questions about her earliest memories, Edmund's late-night search through her belongings, the fragmented conversation she had overheard suggesting someone within the household might be connected to a missing relative of the Duke's own family. Each piece, taken alone, had seemed explainable, coincidental even. Together, illuminated by the small silver locket now resting in her palm, they formed a picture too significant to continue ignoring. She did not know what to do with such overwhelming realization. Part of her wished desperately to seek out the Duke immediately, to share what she had discovered, and seek his guidance in understanding its meaning. Yet another part of her, more cautious and fearful, worried what such a revelation might mean for her position within the household, for the delicate, budding affection that had grown between herself and a man whose entire life and inheritance might be thrown into complete upheaval, should the locket's implications prove true. A sudden sound from the corridor outside her door startled her from her racing thoughts. Footsteps pausing directly outside her room before continuing onward. She quickly wrapped the locket back within its cloth covering and hid it beneath a loose floorboard she had discovered years earlier near the base of her bed, a small hiding place she had used previously for the few personal items she wished to keep entirely private from her roommates. She rose and smoothed her apron carefully, forcing her expression into something resembling calm composure before finally emerging from her room to deliver the aprons as instructed. Yet throughout the remainder of her evening duties, her mind remained fixed upon the hidden locket, upon the name engraved within its delicate silver casing, and upon the unsettling certainty that her quiet, ordinary life as a servant girl within Ashworth Manor was drawing rapidly toward an ending she could not yet fully imagine. That night, once the household had finally settled into silence, Elira retrieved the locket once more from its hiding place, studying it carefully by candlelight, tracing her fingers gently across the worn engraving, as though the repeated action might somehow unlock the memories buried so deeply within her mind. She thought of the portrait she had seen weeks earlier, in the locked east wing, the young woman with dark hair and calm, steady eyes that had felt so strangely familiar, despite Elira's certainty she had never encountered such a face before that night. Could it be, she wondered, staring at her own faint reflection in the small mirror propped against her windowsill, that the woman in that portrait and the name engraved within this locket both pointed toward the very same truth, a truth so significant it had remained hidden and protected for 15 long years, waiting patiently within the walls of this ancient manor for the right moment to finally resurface. She did not sleep again that night, her mind caught between fear and a strange, cautious hope, understanding now with growing certainty that whatever answers awaited her, they would arrive soon, whether she felt prepared to receive them or not. Baron Silas Crane received Colin's hesitant report later that same evening, within a private meeting arranged discreetly near the edge of the estate grounds, far from curious eyes that might otherwise notice such an unusual gathering between a nobleman and a lowly stable hand. Colin spoke nervously of the whispered conversations he had overheard, of growing rumors linking the Duke and the young maid Elira, and of Bridget's warning about secrets deeper than either young woman fully understood. "Has anything specific been found?" Baron Crane asked sharply. "Any object, document, or item that might confirm suspicions regarding her true origins?" "I know nothing of any object, my lord," Colin admitted, clearly uncomfortable beneath the Baron's intense scrutiny. "Only that the household staff whisper constantly of secrets and hidden truths concerning her arrival many years ago." Baron Crane dismissed the young man with a curt nod and a small additional payment, his mind already calculating the swiftest path forward. He could not afford to wait passively while Edmund and Lord Percival continued their careful investigation, gathering proof that would eventually prove impossible to refute. He needed decisive action, something that would either eliminate the threat entirely or delay its resolution long enough for him to secure his considerable holdings against whatever legal challenges might eventually arise, should the missing Duchess truly be confirmed alive. He resolved that very night to arrange a discreet search of the servants' quarters, hoping to uncover whatever physical evidence might exist before Edmund's investigation could formally present it to the Duke. He could not risk conducting such a search personally, understanding well enough that his presence within the servants' wing would raise immediate and dangerous suspicion. Instead, he sought out a household maid he had quietly bribed upon his arrival days earlier, instructing her carefully to search Elira's personal belongings under the pretense of routine inspection, promising generous payment should she discover anything of significance. The maid, a nervous young woman named Prudence, who feared losing her position should she refuse a nobleman's direct request, agreed reluctantly, understanding little of the true stakes involved in the task she had been assigned. Late that same night, while Elira remained occupied assisting with unexpected late preparations for an early morning departure of several guests, Prudence slipped quietly into the room Elira shared with the other maids, her hands trembling as she began carefully searching through the small collection of belongings stored beneath each bed. She found nothing unusual within the wooden chest at the foot of Elira's bed, the same chest Edmund had searched weeks earlier, with similarly disappointing results. Growing increasingly nervous and aware of the risk she had undertaken, Prudence nearly abandoned her search entirely, until her fingers brushed against a slightly loose floorboard near the base of the bed frame, its edge worn smooth from repeated handling that suggested deliberate, frequent use. Her heart pounding, Prudence pried the board loose just enough to reveal the small cloth bundle hidden within the narrow space beneath. Before she could fully retrieve it, however, the sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor sent panic surging through her chest. She quickly pressed the floorboard back into place, though not quite as securely as it had rested before, and hurried from the room just as another maid entered, having returned early from her assigned duties. Elira returned to her own quarters exhausted nearly an hour later, unaware of how narrowly her hidden secret had escaped discovery that very evening. She noticed nothing amiss at first, settling wearily onto her bed without immediately checking her hiding place. It was only the following morning, as she rose to dress for her daily duties, that she noticed the floorboard sitting slightly askew, not quite aligned as she always carefully left it. Alarm shot through her instantly. She knelt quickly, prying the board free and retrieving the small cloth bundle with trembling hands, relief flooding through her as she confirmed the locket remained safely within its hiding place. Yet the discovery that someone had clearly disturbed her hiding spot left her deeply shaken, understanding now with sudden, sharp clarity that she was no longer merely the subject of idle curiosity or harmless rumor, but the target of a search far more deliberate and dangerous than she had previously imagined. She resolved that morning to move the locket to a new hiding place entirely, understanding that whatever secrets surrounded her origins, powerful forces had clearly taken notice, and she could no longer afford the luxury of simply waiting passively for answers to reveal themselves in their own time. Throughout that day, Alira carried the locket hidden carefully within a small pouch sewn into the inside of her apron, unwilling to leave it unattended within her quarters even for a moment. Her thoughts remained scattered and anxious as she moved through her duties, glancing repeatedly at her fellow servants, wondering which among them might have been responsible for disturbing her hiding place, or whether the culprit had been someone from outside the household staff entirely. By late afternoon, she found herself once more near the library, though this time she approached with clear purpose rather than simple habit. She found the Duke alone, reviewing correspondence at his desk, his expression brightening slightly upon noticing her arrival. "Alira," he said warmly, setting aside his papers, "I did not expect to see you again so soon today." "My lord," she said, her voice carrying a seriousness that immediately drew his full attention. "I must show you something, though I confess, I do not fully understand its meaning myself." She withdrew the small cloth bundle from her apron pocket and unwrapped it carefully upon his desk, revealing the tarnished silver locket. The Duke's expression shifted instantly, from curiosity to visible shock, as his eyes fell upon the delicate engraving on its surface. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Hidden within an old blanket among my belongings," Alira said, watching his reaction closely. "I have carried that blanket since my earliest days at the orphanage, though I never before discovered anything sewn within its lining." The Duke lifted the locket with careful, almost reverent hands, opening its small clasp to reveal the miniature portrait within. His breath caught visibly as he studied the tiny painted faces, and Alira watched as something between grief and stunned recognition passed across his features. "This locket belonged to my aunt and uncle," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "The parents of my cousin I sold, who vanished during the uprising that claimed both their lives 15 years ago. I have seen this exact locket in old family portraits, though I believed it lost forever, alongside every other trace of my missing cousin." Alira felt the room seem to tilt slightly around her, the weight of his words settling heavily upon her chest. "Then what does it mean?" she asked, though some deep part of her already suspected the answer. "That I have carried it, hidden within my belongings since childhood." The Duke set down the locket carefully and turned to face her fully, his expression a complicated mixture of hope, disbelief, and something achingly tender that made her heart ache in response. "It means, Alira," he said softly, "that everything Edmund and Lord Percival have suspected these past weeks may indeed be true. It means you may not be who you have always believed yourself to be." The words hung heavily in the quiet library between them, and for a long moment neither spoke, both aware that whatever certainty had existed within their carefully budding relationship now stood upon the edge of complete transformation, one that would soon demand answers neither of them could any longer avoid seeking. Prudence's hands shook so violently that the tray she carried rattled loudly against the dishes upon it, drawing sharp attention from Nora across the busy kitchen. "Girl, what has come over you?" Nora demanded, though Prudence could not find her voice to answer, guilt weighing so heavily upon her that she feared it must be visible upon her very face. She had not slept since disturbing Alira's hiding place 2 nights earlier, tormented by the knowledge of what she had done and growing fear regarding what consequences might follow, should her involvement ever be discovered. She had accepted Baron Crane's payment out of genuine fear for her position, yet the guilt of betraying a fellow servant, one who had always treated her with kindness, despite their different circumstances, had grown unbearable within her conscience. "I must speak with Master Carver," Prudence finally blurted out, setting down her tray abruptly, despite Nora's confused protests. She hurried from the kitchen before anyone could stop her, making her way directly toward Edmund's private study, her resolve strengthening with every hurried step, despite the fear that continued to churn violently within her stomach. She found Edmund reviewing correspondence at his desk, and knocked hesitantly upon his open door. He looked up, clearly surprised by her unexpected appearance. "Prudence," he said, setting aside his papers. "What troubles you?" "I have done something terrible," she said, her voice breaking as tears finally spilled down her cheeks. "Baron Crane paid me to search Alira's belongings 2 nights past. I did not understand the full weight of what he asked, only that I feared losing my position should I refuse a nobleman's direct request. I found nothing of significance, my lord, yet I have carried the guilt of my actions every moment since." Edmund rose quickly from his desk, his expression sharpening with sudden alarm. "Baron Crane asked you to search her belongings specifically?" "Yes, my lord," Prudence confirmed, wiping frantically at her tears. "He seemed most anxious to discover any hidden object or document within her possessions." Edmund's mind raced through the implications of this confession. Baron Crane's suspicions had clearly grown far more urgent and dangerous than he had previously realized, confirming Agnes Whitlow's warnings regarding the ruthless lengths the Baron might pursue to protect his considerable fortune from the threat of a returning true heir. "Thank you for your honesty, Prudence," he said finally. "You have done the right thing coming forward, though I must ask you to remain silent regarding this conversation until I determine the appropriate course of action." Prudence nodded gratefully, relieved to have finally unburdened her guilty conscience, before hurrying from the study to return to her duties, before her extended absence drew further unwanted attention. Edmund sat heavily back into his chair, understanding now that time had grown critically short. He immediately drafted an urgent letter to Lord Percival, requesting his swift return to the estate, along with any additional evidence he might have gathered since their previous meeting, understanding that the confirmation of Alira's true identity could no longer wait for the careful, methodical investigation he had originally intended. Lord Percival arrived at Ashworth Manor just 2 days later, along with Agnes Whitlow herself, both understanding the growing urgency of the situation, following Edmund's detailed letter describing Baron Crane's escalating actions. They gathered privately within the Duke's own study, joined by the Duke and Alira herself, the small silver locket resting upon the desk between them, as tangible proof of the truth they had all begun to suspect. Agnes studied Alira's face closely as they sat together, tears gathering in her aged eyes, as she took in features she had not seen since Alira was but an infant, carried desperately through darkened corridors during the chaos of the uprising 15 years earlier. "You have your mother's eyes," Agnes said softly, reaching out with trembling hands to gently touch Alira's cheek. "I feared I would never live to see this day." "You knew my mother?" Alira asked, her own eyes filling with tears at the emotional weight of the moment. "I was your nursemaid from the very day of your birth," Agnes said, her voice thick with old grief and present joy intermingled. "I carried you from this very estate the night everything changed, praying I might one day see you safely returned to the life that was always meant to be yours." The Duke listened quietly as Agnes recounted the full story of that terrible night, the uprising, the deaths of Alira's true parents, the desperate flight to protect the infant heir from those within the household who had conspired against the family for their own selfish gain. Lord Percival added further confirmation, describing his own memories of Isolde's birth and childhood, memories that matched perfectly with the small crescent-shaped birthmark still visible upon Alira's wrist, a family trait he confirmed had been present in every generation of true Ashworth heirs for as long as recorded history within the family could confirm. "There can be no reasonable doubt remaining," Edmund said finally, once every piece of evidence had been thoroughly presented and discussed. "The locket, the birthmark, Agnes's direct testimony, and the incomplete household records I have spent weeks investigating, all point toward the same undeniable conclusion. Alira is indeed Duchess Isolde, the rightful heir to this very estate, presumed lost for 15 long years." The Duke sat in stunned silence for a long moment, absorbing the full weight of what such confirmation truly meant, not only for Alira herself, but for his own position as current master of an estate that rightfully belonged by law and blood, to the very woman whose growing affection had come to mean so much to him in recent weeks. "What happens now?" Elira asked quietly, her voice trembling with the overwhelming uncertainty of her newly confirmed identity. "Now," Lord Percival said gently, "we must proceed with great caution. Baron Crane has already demonstrated his willingness to act against you, and we must ensure your safety and rightful position are properly secured before any public announcement can be made. I propose we gather sufficient legal documentation and present the full truth formally, during a gathering that will leave Baron Crane no opportunity to dispute or interfere with the outcome." The Duke nodded slowly, though his expression carried a complicated weight of emotions that Elira could not fully interpret. "We will proceed exactly as you suggest, Lord Percival," he said finally. "Elira deserves to have her rightful place restored fully and properly, whatever the personal cost such truth may bring upon myself." As the meeting concluded, and the small group began discussing the careful details of how and when to formally reveal the truth, Elira remained seated quietly, overwhelmed by the sudden transformation of everything she had believed about her own life. Uncertain whether the coming days would bring the joyful restoration of a lost heritage, or whether Baron Crane's dangerous determination to protect his own interests might yet bring greater peril than any of them currently anticipated. Baron Crane, unaware of the full details unfolding within the Duke's private study that afternoon, grew increasingly suspicious when Prudence failed to report back to him as instructed regarding the outcome of her search. He noticed as well the sudden, unexplained arrival of Lord Percival and an unfamiliar elderly woman at the estate, along with an atmosphere of hushed urgency among the senior household staff that suggested significant developments he had not yet been informed of. He sought out Prudence directly that evening, cornering her quietly near the servants' entrance as she returned from delivering supper to the guest chambers. "You did not report to me as arranged," he said, his voice carrying a cold edge beneath its usual polished calm. "What did you discover?" Prudence trembled visibly beneath his intense scrutiny, torn between her guilt-driven confession to Edmund and her genuine fear of the powerful nobleman standing before her. "I found nothing, my lord," she lied, her voice unsteady enough that Baron Crane immediately recognized the deception. "You are lying," he said flatly, stepping closer, his tone carrying an unmistakable threat despite his controlled volume. "I suggest you reconsider your answer very carefully, unless you wish to find yourself dismissed from this household without reference or recommendation." "I only found an old locket, my lord," Prudence admitted finally, breaking beneath the weight of his intimidation. "I gave it no further thought, believing it simply a worthless trinket." Baron Crane's expression darkened considerably at this admission, understanding immediately the significance such an object likely carried. "Where is this locket now?" he demanded. "I do not know, my lord," Prudence said honestly. "I returned it to its hiding place, and have not seen it since." Baron Crane dismissed her with a curt wave, his mind already calculating the implications of this new information. A locket, likely bearing some connection to the Ashworth family crest given the girl's apparent significance, combined with Lord Percival's sudden reappearance and the arrival of an unfamiliar elderly woman, painted a picture he could no longer afford to ignore. The investigation he had hoped might stall indefinitely had clearly progressed far beyond his previous estimates. He retreated to his guest chamber that night, his mind working furiously through the limited options remaining available to him. He could not simply flee the estate without arousing immediate and damning suspicion, yet remaining passive while the truth continued solidifying against him presented equally unacceptable risk to everything he had built over the past 15 years. He resolved that he would need to act decisively, and soon, perhaps discrediting the growing evidence before it could be formally presented, or failing that, ensuring that whatever public revelation eventually occurred happened under circumstances he could still somehow control or manipulate to his own advantage. As he sat alone within his darkened chamber, turning over each possibility with cold, calculating precision, he remained entirely unaware that the very household he sought to manipulate had already gathered sufficient proof to end his carefully constructed deception forever. Proof that would soon be presented before witnesses he would find far more difficult to silence or discredit than he currently believed possible. Later that same night, once Agnes and Lord Percival had retired to their guest chambers, Elira found herself once more in the quiet library, though this time the Duke waited for her rather than the reverse, his expression heavy with unspoken thoughts as she entered. "I hardly know what to say to you now," he admitted, as she settled into the chair across from his own, the familiar warmth between them now complicated by the enormous weight of her true identity. You are no longer simply a servant girl I have grown fond of, Elira. You are Duchess's old, rightful heir to everything I have called my own since returning to manage this estate. I do not feel any different than I did yesterday, Elira said softly, though even as she spoke the words, she understood their truth only partially captured the overwhelming transformation occurring within her own understanding of herself. I am still the same person who scrubbed these very floors only weeks ago. Yet everything around you has changed entirely, the Duke said, rising to pace slowly before the fireplace, his expression troubled. By law and birthright, this estate, its lands, its income, everything I currently manage as Duke, rightfully belongs to you. I find myself uncertain how to proceed, torn between joy at your restored heritage and genuine confusion regarding what such restoration means for my own future, and indeed, for whatever affection has grown between us these past weeks. Elira rose and moved closer to him, her heart aching at the visible turmoil upon his features. Whatever titles or lands the law may eventually restore to me, she said gently, my feelings toward you remain entirely unchanged, Alaric. I care for you not because of what station you hold, but because of who you have shown yourself to be during these recent weeks, kind and thoughtful in ways I never expected from someone of your position. He turned to face her fully, something desperate and hopeful flickering behind his controlled expression. Even should the truth cost me everything I currently possess, he said quietly, I find I care far more about preserving whatever exists between us than protecting my own inheritance or title. Then let us face whatever comes together, Elira said, reaching out to gently take his hand, rather than allowing fear of what might be lost to overshadow what we have already found. He drew her closer, resting his forehead gently against hers, both remaining silent for a long, tender moment, aware that the coming days would test the strength of their growing bond far more severely than either currently anticipated. Neither yet knew of Baron Crane's dangerous calculations occurring simultaneously within his own guest chamber, nor did they fully understand how quickly external pressures, family expectation, and the Baron's desperate schemes would soon converge to threaten the fragile happiness they had only just begun to discover within each other's company. A messenger arrived at Ashworth Manor just after sunrise, breathless from a hard ride, carrying an urgent letter that sent the entire household into sudden disarray. The Duke read the message twice before setting it down upon his desk with visible frustration, calling immediately for Edmund to join him. Lady Vivian Ashcombe arrives this very afternoon, he announced grimly, accompanied by her father, expecting to finalize the marriage arrangement my late father agreed upon years before his passing. I had hoped to delay this matter until Elira's situation was fully and formally resolved, yet it appears circumstances no longer permit such convenient timing. Edmund's expression grew equally troubled. This complicates matters considerably, my lord. Should Baron Crane learn of this timing, he may attempt to use the confusion to his advantage, perhaps encouraging rumors that discredit Elira's claim, before we can properly present our evidence. We must proceed carefully, the Duke said, rubbing his temples with visible exhaustion. I cannot simply refuse Lady Vivian's visit without causing significant offense to her family. Yet I also cannot allow her arrival to interfere with the careful plans we have made regarding Elira's rightful restoration. Word of Lady Vivian's impending arrival spread quickly through the household staff, reaching Elira within the hour, as she assisted with preparations for the unexpected guest. Bridget delivered the news with visible concern, having overheard the housekeeper discussing the matter with several senior servants. They say his father arranged the match years ago, Bridget explained quietly, as they worked together preparing the guest chambers. Lady Vivian comes from considerable wealth and an old respected family. Many believe the Duke has delayed this marriage far longer than propriety typically allows. Elira felt a familiar tightness settle within her chest, though she reminded herself firmly that whatever true feelings existed between herself and the Duke, matters of noble marriage were rarely governed by such feelings alone, particularly when family obligation and considerable fortune remained involved. The Duke will handle the matter as he sees fit, she said carefully, though her voice carried less conviction than she intended. Lady Vivian arrived precisely as the letter had promised, accompanied by an entourage befitting her considerable status, her carriage drawing to a stop before the manor's grand entrance amid a flurry of attending servants. She emerged elegantly dressed in fine silk, her expression carrying the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to receiving whatever she desired, without significant resistance. "Duke Alaric," she greeted warmly, extending her hand as he descended the front steps to receive her properly. "It has been far too long since our families last discussed the arrangements your father so wisely established between us." "Lady Vivian," the Duke replied with careful, practiced courtesy, "welcome to Ashworth Manor. I trust your journey was pleasant." As formal pleasantries continued between the Duke and his unexpected guest, Elira found herself assigned to help serve refreshments within the drawing room, an assignment that placed her uncomfortably close to observing the interaction between the Duke and the woman, clearly intended to become his future wife, according to long-standing family arrangement. She moved quietly through her duties, careful to maintain the composed, invisible presence expected of household staff, though she could not entirely suppress the discomfort growing within her chest as she watched Lady Vivian's easy familiarity with the Duke, born from years of prior acquaintance and shared social standing that Elira herself could never claim to possess. Lady Vivian noticed Elira's presence eventually, her sharp eyes studying the young servant with obvious curiosity as she poured fresh tea into delicate porcelain cups. "You have new staff since my last visit, Alaric," she observed, her tone carrying subtle condescension. "This one carries herself rather differently than one typically expects from household servants." "Elira has served this household for many years," the Duke replied carefully, his tone neutral despite the tension visibly building beneath his controlled expression. "She is among our most trusted staff." Lady Vivian's gaze lingered a moment longer upon Elira before returning to the Duke, though something calculating flickered briefly behind her polished smile. "How curious," she said simply, before returning to the conversation regarding wedding preparations that had clearly been the true purpose behind her unexpected visit. Throughout the remainder of the afternoon, Elira observed with growing unease as Lady Vivian's father discussed formal wedding arrangements with obvious enthusiasm, clearly assuming the marriage between his daughter and the Duke remained simply a matter of finalizing convenient dates, rather than any genuine uncertainty regarding the Duke's own wishes. The Duke handled the conversation with careful diplomacy, neither confirming nor denying the assumed arrangement, though Elira could see the visible strain such careful navigation placed upon him throughout the lengthy discussion. It was not until evening, once Lady Vivian and her father had retired to their guest chambers, that Elira found opportunity to speak privately with the Duke regarding the day's uncomfortable developments. She found him alone in his study, his expression exhausted from the day's careful diplomatic maneuvering. "You did not tell her the truth," Elira observed quietly, closing the door behind her. "I could not. Not yet," the Duke admitted, rubbing his temples wearily. "Not until your position within this family has been properly and formally established. Announcing my personal feelings toward you prematurely, before your rightful identity has been legally confirmed, would only create additional scandal and complication that neither of us can currently afford." "I understand the necessity," Elira said, though her voice carried an edge of frustration she could not fully suppress. Yet watching her speak so confidently of a future she assumes already belongs to her proved more difficult than I anticipated. The Duke crossed the room quickly, taking her hands gently within his own. "Elira, I promise you, whatever arrangement my father once established with Lady Vivian's family holds no bearing upon my true feelings. I intend to see the truth of your identity fully confirmed and properly presented, after which I will address the matter of Lady Vivian's expectations, honestly and directly, whatever consequences such honesty might bring." She wanted desperately to believe his reassurance completely, yet the growing complexity of circumstances surrounding them both, Baron Crane's dangerous scheming, Lady Vivian's confident assumptions, the delicate balance of proof still required, before any public revelation could safely occur, left her with a persistent unease that refused to fully dissipate, despite the Duke's genuine sincerity. As they stood together within the quiet study, neither yet aware that Baron Crane had already begun formulating his own desperate plan to exploit Lady Vivian's presence, and the general confusion surrounding the household's current circumstances, hoping to discredit Elira's claim entirely, before Lord Percival and Edmund could finalize the evidence needed to expose both her true identity and his own carefully hidden role in the tragedy that had stolen away her rightful inheritance 15 years earlier. Baron Crane wasted little time seeking a private audience with Lady Vivian's father, a wealthy nobleman named Lord Ashcombe, whom he had known casually through various social circles over the years. He found the older man enjoying a quiet drink within the guest wing's private sitting room and approached with the same practiced charm he employed throughout every social interaction. "Lord Ashcombe," he said warmly, settling into a nearby chair without waiting for formal invitation. "I trust your journey proved comfortable, and that discussions regarding your daughter's upcoming marriage progressed smoothly." "Well enough," Lord Ashcombe replied, though something in his tone suggested lingering uncertainty. "Though I confess the Duke seemed rather distracted throughout our conversation today, less enthusiastic than I might have hoped, regarding an arrangement his own father considered settled years ago." Baron Crane seized upon this opening immediately, his expression shifting into careful, concerned confidentiality. "I hesitate to speak of matters not entirely my own concern," he said slowly, as though reluctant to share troubling information. "Yet as a longtime friend of this family, I feel obligated to mention certain rumors currently circulating throughout the household staff." "What rumors?" Lord Ashcombe asked, his interest clearly piqued. "Nothing certain, you understand," Baron Crane continued carefully. "Only whispers suggesting the Duke has developed an inappropriate fondness for one of his household servants, a young maid whose sudden prominence within this estate has raised considerable question among longtime staff. Some even suggest wild claims regarding her supposed noble birth, though I personally find such rumors rather difficult to credit." Lord Ashcombe's expression darkened considerably at this revelation. "Are you suggesting the Duke's affections lie elsewhere, potentially compromising the arrangement between our families?" "I suggest nothing definitively," Baron Crane said smoothly. "Only that you might wish to observe the situation carefully yourself, before finalizing any formal commitments. I would hate to see your daughter's reputation entangled in scandal, should such rumors eventually prove accurate, or worse, deliberately fabricated by ambitious servants hoping to elevate their own station through false claims of noble birth." Lord Ashcombe absorbed this information with visible unease, thanking Baron Crane for his apparent concern, before excusing himself to seek out his daughter, intending to share this troubling information and discuss how best to proceed given such uncertain circumstances. Baron Crane watched him depart with quiet satisfaction, understanding that he had successfully planted seeds of doubt that might prove useful in discrediting Alira's claim, or at minimum, in creating sufficient confusion and delay to buy himself additional time to formulate a more permanent solution to the growing threat against his carefully protected secrets. He returned to his own chamber that evening, resolved that manipulation and rumor alone would likely prove insufficient, given the mounting evidence Edmund and Lord Percival had clearly gathered. He began composing a careful letter to several influential contacts he had cultivated over the years, individuals who owed him considerable favor and who might prove useful in discrediting witnesses or delaying formal legal proceedings, should the situation eventually require such drastic intervention. Whatever it required, he resolved grimly, he would not allow 15 years of carefully constructed fortune and influence to collapse simply because an orphaned servant girl happened to survive circumstances he had once believed permanently resolved. Lady Vivian sought out Alira the following morning, finding her alone in the linen room, sorting freshly laundered sheets. She entered without announcement, her expression carrying none of the polished warmth she had displayed toward the Duke and his guests the previous day. "You are the servant girl my father spoke of," Lady Vivian said coolly, studying Alira with obvious scrutiny, the one supposedly claiming noble birth. Alira straightened immediately, startled by the direct confrontation. "I have made no such claims myself, my lady," she said carefully. "Whatever discoveries have occurred regarding my origins have come through the careful investigation of others, not through any assertion of my own making." "Yet you do not deny such claims exist," Lady Vivian pressed, moving closer with calculated precision. "Tell me honestly, do you harbor feelings for the Duke that extend beyond appropriate boundaries for someone of your current station?" Alira felt her cheeks flush, despite her best efforts to maintain composure. "My lady, whatever feelings may exist between myself and the Duke are matters I do not believe appropriate to discuss with you." "How convenient an answer," Lady Vivian said, her tone sharpening further. "Understand this clearly, girl. The arrangement between myself and the Duke has stood for years, established through careful negotiation between two respected families. I will not allow some servant's fanciful claims of hidden nobility to interfere with an arrangement my family has long anticipated. I have sought nothing beyond honesty regarding my own uncertain past, my lady, Alira replied, finding unexpected strength within herself despite the intimidating pressure of the noblewoman's presence. Whatever truth eventually emerges will do so regardless of anyone's personal wishes or arrangements, including my own. Lady Vivian studied her for a long, tense moment, clearly unaccustomed to encountering such quiet resolve from someone of Alira's supposed station. We shall see, she said finally, turning to leave the room with sharp, deliberate steps. I do not intend to relinquish my rightful place easily, whatever fanciful claims circulate through this household's gossip. Once alone again, Alira sank onto a nearby stool, her hands trembling slightly from the tense confrontation. She understood now, more clearly than before, that the coming revelation of her true identity would not proceed smoothly or without significant resistance from those whose own interests and expectations stood to be disrupted by such truth. She sought out the Duke later that same day, finding him reviewing correspondence within his study, and relayed the uncomfortable encounter with Lady Vivian in careful detail. His expression grew increasingly troubled as she spoke, understanding clearly the mounting pressure building from multiple directions simultaneously. This cannot continue much longer, he said finally, once she had finished her account. The uncertainty itself creates opportunity for exactly this sort of confrontation and manipulation. I will speak with Edmund and Lord Percival today regarding finalizing our plans. We must proceed with the formal revelation as swiftly as circumstances safely allow, before Baron Crane's schemes or Lady Vivian's determined resistance create complications too significant to overcome. That evening, the small group gathered once more within the Duke's private study. Edmund, Lord Percival, Agnes, the Duke, and Alira herself, discussing the careful details of how best to proceed. After lengthy deliberation, they settled upon a plan. The Duke would host a formal gathering within the week, inviting prominent regional nobility, including Lord Ashcombe and his daughter, under the pretense of a celebration, honoring the estate's continued prosperity. During this gathering, Lord Percival would formally present the accumulated evidence confirming Alira's true identity as Duchess Isolde, before the assembled witnesses whose social standing would lend undeniable credibility to such an extraordinary claim. Baron Crane will certainly attend, given his current presence at the estate, Edmund observed cautiously. We must anticipate that he may attempt some manner of disruption or counter-accusation once the truth becomes formally presented. Then we shall ensure our evidence remains beyond any reasonable dispute, Lord Percival said firmly. The locket, Agnes's direct testimony, the birthmark matching generations of confirmed family history, and whatever additional documentation Edmund's continued investigation might yet uncover. Baron Crane may attempt whatever desperate maneuvering he wishes, but the truth itself, once properly presented, will prove impossible to successfully refute. As the meeting concluded and plans solidified for the formal gathering that would finally reveal the truth, long hidden within Ashworth Manor's walls, Alira felt a complicated mixture of anticipation and dread settling within her chest. Understanding that the coming days would bring the culmination of everything set into motion since Lord Percival's shocked reaction during that first fateful banquet weeks earlier. A culmination that promised to transform not only her own life entirely, but the lives of everyone connected to the long-hidden secrets of Ashworth Manor. The great hall of Ashworth Manor blazed with candlelight as dozens of assembled guests mingled in anticipation, unaware that the evening's true purpose extended far beyond the simple celebration announced upon their invitations. Alira stood near a side entrance, dressed for the first time in fine clothing, provided by the Duke himself, her heart pounding so violently she feared everyone present might somehow hear it, despite the surrounding noise of polite conversation and clinking glasses. Lord Percival rose at the appointed moment, tapping his glass gently to draw the assembled crowd's attention, his expression carrying the weight of 15 years of buried secrets, finally approaching their long-overdue resolution. "Distinguished guests," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the now quieting hall. "I thank you all for joining us this evening. I must confess, however, that tonight's gathering serves a purpose considerably more significant than simple celebration." Murmurs of curiosity rippled through the assembled crowd as Lord Percival gestured toward Alira, who stepped forward hesitantly from the side entrance, every eye in the hall turning immediately toward her. 15 years ago, Lord Percival continued, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly building within him. This very estate suffered a terrible uprising that claimed the lives of the reigning Duke and Duchess, and stole away their infant daughter, believed lost forever. Tonight, I stand before you to reveal that this belief was tragically mistaken. Gasps erupted throughout the hall as Lord Percival continued, explaining in careful detail the evidence gathered over recent weeks, the silver locket bearing the family crest, the testimony of the very nursemaid who had carried the infant Duchess to safety that terrible night, and the birthmark confirmed present across countless generations of true Ashworth heirs. The young woman standing before you, Lord Percival announced finally, his voice ringing with absolute conviction, is not merely a household servant, as many of you have believed these past years. She is Duchess Isolde Ashworth, rightful heir to this very estate, returned to us after 15 long years of tragic, mistaken separation. The hall erupted into stunned chaos, guests turning toward one another in shocked disbelief, whispers rising quickly into a confused murmur that filled the grand space entirely. Elira stood frozen at the center of such overwhelming attention, her eyes seeking out the Duke, who watched her from across the hall with an expression she could not fully interpret, caught somewhere between profound relief and painful realization regarding everything such revelation now meant for his own position. It was then that Baron Silas Crane rose sharply from his seat, his composed expression finally cracking beneath visible alarm. "This is absurd!" he declared loudly, his voice carrying desperate urgency despite his attempt to maintain dignified composure. A servant girl suddenly claiming noble birth, based on nothing more than a trinket and the fading memories of an elderly nursemaid? Surely such extraordinary claims require far more substantial proof than what has been offered here tonight. The proof exists in abundance, Baron Crane, Edmund replied firmly, stepping forward from where he had been standing quietly near the hall's entrance. Perhaps you might explain instead why your own household records, examined carefully these past weeks, reveal considerable unexplained wealth, acquired precisely during the chaotic months, following the very uprising that stole away this young woman's rightful inheritance. The color drained visibly from Baron Crane's face, as every eye within the hall turned toward him now, curiosity shifting rapidly toward suspicion. "I do not understand your implication," he said, though his voice carried far less conviction than moments earlier. "I believe you understand perfectly well," Agnes said, rising slowly from her seat despite her advanced age, her voice trembling with old anger, finally given voice, after 15 years of enforced silence. "I recognized you immediately upon your arrival here, Baron Crane, though I said nothing until I possessed sufficient courage and proof to speak openly. You arrived at this estate suspiciously prepared on the very night of the uprising, offering assistance that conveniently positioned you to claim considerable land and title, once the true heirs could no longer contest such claims. These are baseless accusations from a senile old woman," Baron Crane said sharply, though sweat had begun visibly forming upon his brow despite the cool evening air. "Are they baseless?" Lord Percival interjected. "When combined with sworn testimony from 3 separate former household staff members, recently located and questioned discreetly these past days, who confirm witnessing your private meetings with the very mercenaries responsible for the violent uprising that killed Duke Rowan and his wife." The hall fell into complete, shocked silence at this final, devastating revelation. Baron Crane looked around desperately at the assembled crowd, searching for any remaining ally or sympathetic face, finding only stunned disbelief and mounting suspicion directed entirely toward himself. Lady Vivian, seated nearby, stared at him with visible horror, understanding suddenly the true source of the rumors he had so carefully planted against Elira merely days earlier. "You orchestrated the very tragedy that stole away my inheritance," Elira said quietly, though her voice carried clearly across the silent hall, "then spent years living comfortably from the fortune gained through such horrific betrayal, while I grew up believing myself an orphan, with no family or history whatsoever." Baron Crane's composed mask finally shattered entirely beneath the weight of accumulated evidence and public exposure. He attempted a hasty retreat toward the hall's main entrance, only to find his path blocked by estate guards summoned discreetly by Edmund in anticipation of exactly such a desperate reaction. "You will answer fully for your crimes," Baron Crane, the Duke said, finally stepping forward from where he had stood in stunned silence throughout the dramatic unfolding of truth before him. Before proper legal authority, and before the family whose tragedy you so callously exploited for your own selfish gain. Baron Crane was led away under guard, his protests growing increasingly desperate and incoherent as the full weight of his exposed crimes settled upon him. The comfortable life he had built through betrayal and deception, collapsing entirely within the span of a single devastating evening. Once the immediate chaos began settling, the Duke crossed the hall slowly toward Illyra, his expression carrying an overwhelming mixture of emotions: relief that her rightful identity had finally been properly restored, alongside a painful, sinking realization regarding what such restoration meant for his own future, and the delicate affection that had grown so carefully between them these past weeks. "Isolde," he said softly, testing her true name for the first time, "I find myself uncertain what words could possibly address everything that has occurred tonight." She studied his troubled expression carefully, understanding the complicated weight he now carried, torn between joy at her restoration and the sudden, stark realization that everything he currently possessed, his title, his estate, his very position within this household, rightfully belonged to the very woman he had grown to care for so deeply. "Nor do I, Alaric," she admitted quietly, her own emotions equally overwhelming, as she absorbed the full reality of her transformed circumstances. "Tonight has changed everything, and I fear we have not yet fully understood all that such change will ultimately demand from us both." Around them, the assembled guests continued their hushed, stunned conversations, processing the extraordinary revelation they had just witnessed, while somewhere within the depths of the manor, guards secured Baron Crane's escape route entirely, ensuring that whatever justice awaited him would finally arrive after 15 long years of evading the consequences of his terrible betrayal. Later that night, once the guests had finally departed and the manor settled into an unusual, exhausted quiet, Illyra found herself standing alone within the very locked room where she had first discovered the portrait that started this entire extraordinary chain of events. She studied the painted face once more, understanding now with complete clarity that the woman gazing back at her from within the frame was her own mother, Duchess Elaine Ashworth, taken from her so violently when she was merely an infant, unable to remember any of it. Bridget found her there sometime later, hesitant to intrude, yet unable to resist checking on her friend following such an overwhelming evening. "I hardly know what to call you now," Bridget admitted softly, standing uncertainly near the doorway. "Illyra remains my name as much as Isolde does," she replied, turning to face her friend with a tired, genuine smile. "You need not change how you address me, Bridget. Whatever titles the law now grants me. Everything has changed so quickly," Bridget said, moving closer. "Only weeks ago, we shared a small room together as fellow servants. Now you stand to inherit this entire estate. I confess I do not yet know how to process everything that has occurred," Isolde admitted honestly. "For years, I believed myself simply an orphan, with no history, no family, no connection to anything beyond this household's daily routine. Now I discover I am the very Duchess this entire estate has quietly mourned for 15 years, while the man responsible for that tragic loss lived comfortably among us, even dining at this very table alongside the family he betrayed so completely." Bridget squeezed her hand gently, understanding the overwhelming weight such realization must carry. "Whatever comes next," she said softly, "know that you remain my friend, regardless of whatever grand title now precedes your name." Isolde thanked her quietly, grateful for such simple, genuine loyalty amid the extraordinary upheaval surrounding her transformed circumstances. Once Bridget departed, she remained alone a while longer within the quiet portrait room, her thoughts turning increasingly toward the Duke, toward Alaric, and the complicated reality now standing between them, despite whatever genuine affection had grown so naturally during her time serving as a simple household maid. She understood now, with painful clarity, that his feelings toward her had developed and deepened while he still believed her merely a servant girl, unaware of the noble blood truly flowing within her veins. Such genuine affection, born from simple honesty rather than any awareness of rank or fortune, carried a particular sweetness she treasured deeply. Yet she could not entirely ignore the uncomfortable truth that his discovery of her true identity arrived only after 15 years of stolen inheritance, after she had already endured years of humble servitude within halls that rightfully belonged to her from birth. Had circumstances unfolded differently, had the truth emerged sooner, before her heart had grown so attached to a man whose very position now stood in direct complication with her own restored rights, perhaps their path forward together might have proven simpler. Instead, she found herself caught between genuine feeling and the painful awareness that recognition, however heartfelt, had arrived considerably later than circumstances might have otherwise allowed, leaving her uncertain whether love discovered under such complicated conditions could truly flourish as simply and naturally as it might have under different, kinder circumstances. She resolved that night, standing quietly before her mother's painted image, that whatever future awaited her and the Duke, she would need time to fully understand her restored identity, to properly grieve the family and childhood stolen so violently from her, and to determine clearly whether her feelings toward Alaric could withstand the complicated weight of everything that had finally, if belatedly, come to light within the ancient walls of Ashworth Manor. The following morning brought further resolution regarding Baron Crane's fate, as regional magistrates arrived at the estate to formally process the overwhelming evidence Edmund and Lord Percival had carefully gathered over recent weeks. Baron Crane, confronted with sworn testimony from multiple former household staff, alongside detailed financial records revealing the suspicious timing of his acquired wealth, offered little meaningful defense against the charges now formally presented before him. "You will forfeit all lands and titles acquired since the uprising," the presiding magistrate announced firmly, "pending full investigation into your role in orchestrating violence against the Ashworth family. Given the severity of these charges, you shall remain in custody until formal proceedings can be properly scheduled." Baron Crane offered no response beyond a final, bitter glance toward Isolde, as guards led him away toward a waiting carriage that would carry him toward proper confinement, his years of carefully constructed fortune and influence collapsing entirely within the span of a single morning. Lady Vivian and her father, thoroughly disturbed by revelations regarding the false rumors Baron Crane had planted merely days earlier, departed the estate shortly afterward, their planned marriage arrangement quietly abandoned amid the overwhelming complications of recent events, though they parted with the Duke on courteous terms, understanding well enough that circumstances beyond anyone's reasonable control had rendered their prior arrangement no longer suitable for either family. Edmund watched the departing carriages with quiet satisfaction, understanding that his careful, methodical investigation had finally achieved its intended purpose, restoring rightful justice after 15 long years of hidden betrayal. He found Isolde standing near the manor's entrance, watching the same departing carriages with an expression that mixed relief with visible exhaustion from the overwhelming events of recent days. "You have done this household a great service, Edmund," she said as he approached. "I do not believe I could ever properly express sufficient gratitude for your careful diligence in uncovering the truth of my origins." "I simply followed where the evidence led, my lady," Edmund replied humbly, though genuine pride showed clearly within his expression. "The courage to face such truth, however, belonged entirely to yourself." Isolde offered him a genuine, grateful smile, before turning back toward the manor, understanding that while Baron Crane's exposure and Lady Vivian's departure resolved considerable immediate complication, the deeper questions regarding her own future, her relationship with Alaric, and her place within a household she had served as a simple maid only weeks earlier, remained far from fully settled. Such answers, she understood clearly, would require considerably more time and careful reflection than the swift, dramatic events of recent days had allowed her to properly process. The formal document sat between them upon the study desk, its elegant script confirming what everyone within Ashworth Manor had come to understand these past weeks, that Isolde Ashworth stood as rightful holder of every title, every acre of land, and every measure of fortune the estate possessed. Alaric stared at the paper for a long moment, before finally lifting the pen, his hand trembling slightly, as he prepared to formally sign away everything he had managed and called his own, since returning from his years abroad. "You need not do this so quickly," Isolde said softly, watching his visible struggle with quiet sympathy. "There remains no urgent deadline forcing such immediate transfer." "The longer such matters remain unresolved," Alaric replied, his voice carrying a mixture of resignation and genuine respect for what proper justice demanded, "the more opportunity exists for further complication or dispute. You deserve your rightful inheritance restored fully and properly, Isolde, without unnecessary delay, simply to spare my own difficult feelings regarding the matter. He signed the document with careful, deliberate strokes, formally transferring the full weight of the Ashworth estate back into the hands of its true and rightful heir. Lord Percival, present as official witness alongside Edmund, nodded solemnly as the transfer was properly completed and sealed according to established legal custom. "It is done," Lord Percival announced quietly. "Duchess Isolde Ashworth, you stand now as full and rightful mistress of this entire estate, exactly as circumstance and birthright always intended." Isolde accepted the news with complicated emotion, relief and vindication, mixing uncomfortably alongside genuine concern for Alaric, who now found himself without the title and position he had spent years dutifully managing on behalf of a family he believed extinct beyond his own direct line. "What will you do now?" she asked once Lord Percival and Edmund had departed to attend to the considerable paperwork such formal transfer required. "I retain my personal fortune, inherited independently through my mother's family," Alaric said, offering a tired but genuine smile, despite the significant loss he had just formally accepted. "I shall manage well enough, Isolde. Perhaps I might even discover interests beyond simple estate management that I never previously had opportunity to properly explore." She studied him carefully, understanding the tremendous grace he displayed in accepting such significant loss without visible bitterness or resentment. "I confess, I do not yet know what to make of everything that has transpired between us these recent weeks," she admitted honestly. "My feelings toward you remain genuine, yet I find myself needing time to properly understand my own restored identity before I can fairly consider what future, if any, might exist between us." Alec nodded slowly, disappointment visible despite his obvious effort to remain understanding. "I respect whatever time you require, Isolde. I only hope that whatever decision you eventually reach, you will not entirely close the possibility of what we discovered together during those weeks before either of us understood your true origins." In the days that followed, Isolde settled gradually into her transformed role as rightful Duchess, learning alongside Edmund the considerable responsibilities such position demanded, reviewing estate finances, meeting with regional officials, and slowly becoming acquainted with the full scope of the inheritance so violently stolen from her 15 years earlier. She maintained careful, respectful distance from Alaric during this period, understanding that she needed genuine clarity regarding her own feelings before allowing romantic considerations to further complicate her already overwhelming transition. Alaric, for his part, respected her need for space, though he remained present within the estate, assisting quietly whenever his experience proved useful, careful never to overstep the boundaries she had established. He watched from a respectful distance as she gradually grew into her rightful position, taking quiet pride in witnessing the same qualities that had originally drawn his affection: her honesty, her quiet strength, her genuine care for the household staff who had once been her fellow servants, now blossoming fully within a role finally suited to her true nature. Bridget remained close throughout this transition, one of the few from Isolde's former life as a servant who continued visiting regularly, their friendship remaining genuine and unaffected by the dramatic shift in circumstance. "You seem more settled these past days," Bridget observed one afternoon as they walked together through the same gardens where Isolde had once shared quiet morning conversations with Alaric. "I am beginning to understand who I truly am," Isolde admitted, "beyond simply the servant girl I believed myself to be, or the Duchess circumstance has now restored me to. I find myself somewhere between those two identities, carrying pieces of both within myself permanently." "And what of the Duke?" Bridget asked carefully, aware of the delicate subject she broached. Isolde was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I care for him still, Bridget, genuinely and deeply, yet I find myself troubled by how our story unfolded, by how close I came to living my entire life without ever knowing my true history, while he unknowingly managed an inheritance that was never truly his own to claim. I do not blame him for such circumstance, understanding he possessed no knowledge of the truth himself, yet I cannot help wondering whether recognition, however genuine, arrived simply too late for us to build something uncomplicated between us." Weeks passed in this manner, Isolde gradually establishing herself fully within her rightful role, while Alaric maintained his respectful, patient distance, hoping quietly that time might eventually soften whatever hesitation currently stood between them. He busied himself exploring new interests beyond estate management, discovering unexpected enjoyment in local charitable works, supporting families still recovering from hardships stemming from the very uprising that had once stolen away Isolde's childhood. It was during one such charitable visit, several months after the dramatic revelation that had transformed both their lives so completely, that Isolde encountered Alaric unexpectedly, while touring a newly established shelter for children, orphaned by circumstances similar to her own tragic history. She watched quietly from a distance, as he knelt patiently beside a young child, listening attentively to the boy's simple concerns, with genuine warmth that reminded her powerfully of the man she had first come to care for, during quiet evenings spent together in the estate library, long before either of them understood the complicated truth that would eventually stand between them. He noticed her presence eventually, rising to greet her with careful, respectful distance, despite the evident warmth still visible within his expression. "Duchess Isolde," he said formally, though something gentle remained within his tone despite the careful title. "I did not expect to find you here today." "Nor I you," she replied, offering a genuine smile despite the lingering complexity of their relationship. "You seem to have found meaningful purpose within these charitable efforts." "I find genuine satisfaction in helping those who have suffered similar hardship to your own," he admitted honestly. "Perhaps it offers some small measure of restitution for circumstances I unknowingly benefited from, however unintentionally. During those years I managed an inheritance that was never truly mine to claim." Isolde studied him carefully, recognizing genuine humility within his words, a quality she had always admired since their earliest conversations together. "You have grown, Alaric," she observed quietly, "in ways I did not fully anticipate when we last spoke honestly of our uncertain future together." "I have had considerable time for reflection," he said, "and I have come to understand more clearly the weight of what circumstance once granted me unfairly, alongside genuine appreciation for who you truly are, beyond simply the title or fortune now rightfully restored to you." They stood together for a long, quiet moment amid the gentle sounds of children playing nearby, both understanding that whatever future might eventually exist between them would require continued patience, honest communication, and genuine effort to overcome the complicated circumstances that had once separated simple, honest affection from the overwhelming weight of restored nobility and long-delayed justice. "Perhaps," Isolde said finally, offering him a small, genuine smile that carried real warmth, despite the careful distance she had maintained these recent months. "We might begin again, slowly, and see what honest friendship, unburdened by uncertainty or hidden truth, might eventually grow into between us." Alaric's answering smile carried genuine hope, understanding well enough that such careful beginning offered no guarantee of the future either of them might privately wish for, yet representing nonetheless a meaningful step forward from the painful distance that had defined their relationship since the dramatic revelation of her true identity. As they walked together slowly through the charitable grounds, discussing simple, honest matters unburdened by titles or inheritance, both understood that whatever ultimately grew between them would need to be built carefully and patiently, honoring both the genuine affection first discovered during simpler days and the complicated, painful truth that had once threatened to separate them entirely. The story of Ashworth Manor, of a servant who discovered herself to be its long-lost Duchess, and the Duke who nearly lost everything through simply loving her too late to fully understand who she truly was, would eventually become known throughout the region as a tale of justice finally restored after 15 long years of hidden betrayal. Yet for Isolde and Alaric themselves, the true ending remained still unwritten, a careful, hopeful beginning rather than a definitive conclusion, built patiently upon the foundation of honest affection, hard-earned wisdom, and the quiet understanding that even truths discovered too late might yet, with sufficient patience and genuine effort, find their way toward a future worth carefully building together. In the months that followed their tentative reconciliation, Isolde devoted considerable energy toward reforming several outdated practices within her household, ensuring that servants who had once worked alongside her received fair wages and genuine respect, understanding intimately as she did the daily struggles and quiet dignity required of such position. Bridget herself accepted a promoted role overseeing the household staff directly, a position Isolde insisted she had earned through years of loyal friendship and diligent service, long before either of them understood the true nobility hidden within Isolde's own blood. Edmund continued serving faithfully as steward, though Isolde granted him considerably expanded authority and recognition for the careful investigation that had ultimately restored her rightful inheritance. Lord Percival visited regularly throughout the following year, delighting in watching the granddaughter of his oldest friends grow steadily into her rightful position, offering guidance whenever complicated matters of estate management or noble obligation required experienced perspective. Agnes Whitlow, the elderly nursemaid whose courage and careful preservation of the family locket had ultimately made the entire revelation possible, accepted Isolde's grateful invitation to reside permanently within Ashworth Manor, spending her remaining years finally reunited with the child she had once desperately protected during the darkest night of the family's history. Their bond deepened considerably during this time, Agnes sharing countless stories of Isolde's parents and early childhood that helped restore precious memories otherwise lost entirely to the tragic circumstances of the uprising. Baron Silas Crane faced formal trial several months later, the overwhelming evidence gathered against him leaving little room for successful defense. He was stripped permanently of every title and holding acquired through his betrayal, sentenced to considerable imprisonment for his role in orchestrating violence against the Ashworth family, finally facing consequences that had eluded him for 15 undeserved years of comfortable, ill-gotten fortune. As for Alaric and Isolde themselves, their careful, patient courtship continued slowly throughout the following seasons, each visit and conversation gradually rebuilding the trust and genuine affection first discovered during those quiet evenings spent together in the estate library, long before either understood the complicated truth that would eventually test the strength of their growing bond. They did not rush toward any hasty declaration or premature commitment, both having learned valuable wisdom from the painful complications born of truth, arriving too late to allow simple, uncomplicated happiness. Nearly a year after the dramatic revelation that had transformed both their lives so completely, Alaric found himself once more within the same garden, where he and Isolde had first shared honest conversation, as master and servant, long before either understood the true significance hidden within her ordinary, unassuming presence. He watched her now, dressed in the fine clothing befitting her true station, directing gardeners with the same quiet confidence and genuine care she had once shown, while simply arranging flowers for the manor's grand hall. "You seem entirely at home here now," he observed, approaching slowly along the familiar gravel path. "I have had considerable time to grow into this role," she replied, offering him the warm, genuine smile that had first captured his attention so many months earlier. "Though I confess, some part of me will always remember these gardens as the place where I first began to understand that honest connection matters far more than any title or circumstance might otherwise suggest." "I have waited patiently, as you asked of me," Alaric said carefully, "yet I find myself hoping that perhaps sufficient time has now passed for us to speak more directly of what future might exist between us." Isolde studied him for a long, thoughtful moment, recognizing genuine sincerity and patient growth within his careful words. "I believe it has," she said finally, her smile widening with genuine warmth. "I find that my feelings toward you, tested though they were by circumstance and complicated truth, have only grown stronger through this careful, patient period we have shared together." Their hands found each other naturally as they continued walking together through the fragrant garden, both understanding that whatever future now lay ahead would be built upon a foundation far stronger than simple, uncomplicated affection alone, forged instead through genuine trust, patient understanding, and the hard-earned wisdom that even truths discovered too late might yet, with sufficient care and honest effort, find their way toward a lasting happiness neither had fully believed possible during those difficult, uncertain months following her extraordinary, long-overdue restoration. The manor itself seemed to settle into peaceful contentment around them, its ancient stone walls finally free from the shadow of hidden betrayal that had lingered silently for 15 long years, replaced instead by the quiet, hopeful promise of a future built honestly upon truth, finally brought fully into the light.